Good morning. This is where you say good morning. Okay, just checking. So did y'all go out in the town last night and have a good time? Those that did are not here this morning, probably. That's how that works. Well, thanks for making it back. It's always an issue this time of year in Boulder when we have a conference. Usually by the second day, people figure out that Boulder's a lot of fun to be out in the sunshine and go hiking. So I appreciate you all showing up today. Before I get started today, this seems like a good opportunity for me to do another thank you. There's been a lot of thank yous at this conference, but one thank you I haven't done that I really need to do is to thank the Bureau of Reclamation and the International Joint Commission, which both stepped up to help sponsor the conference itself, and there's been other sponsors for the workshops themselves, and I believe those sponsors have been thanked, but I want to thank the Reclamation and the IJC for helping us with this event. The registration fees that many, but not all of you paid, cover a pretty small fraction of the cost of doing this sort of thing. So those sponsors are very important. So that's not, I don't know if anyone's here from either organization, but just in case they are, thank you. It's very much appreciated. Secondly, I have a little housekeeping announcement. Actually, it is really a housekeeping announcement. We got in a little trouble for leaving a mess here yesterday. So pick up your stuff and throw it away today if you could. Because remember, you're not supposed to have food and stuff in here, but you know, that's supposed to in air quotes there, but okay. All right, but that's it for my announcements. Let's get started with today's session. Today's session is primarily based on the largest of the three workshops we had this week, the workshop looking at water scarcity and drought in federations. The primary organizers of that workshop thus will be drafted, or I don't know if it's volunteered or drafted. It was somewhere in between to run the proceedings today, which I'm very excited about. So I will turn it over now to Dustin Garrick and Lucia DiStefano, who will handle the first session. Let me see. And Daniel Connell will handle the part two of that. I don't know if I need to introduce you guys by now because you're famous. I'll say a sentence or two about each. Dustin is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it fair to say you're in a bit of transition, moving from McMaster University in Canada to the University of Oxford, which I believe is a dusty old school across the pond, as I understand it. Lucia is also based at one of the world's oldest universities, but one I cannot pronounce correctly, Complutense? It's not perfect. Everyone's humoring me this week. Complutense University of Madrid, place I've never been, but I keep making a list in this conference of all the places that I had never been that I really want to go, and that's on my list. But they will handle things this morning, and with that, you guys ready to go?
Sure.
All right.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the end of a really stimulating week of events, feeding in a series of workshops on indigenous water justice, environmental flows, and learning from drought crises and federations, which I'll be speaking about this morning. Framing up a series of discussions about what we can learn from the experiences in the rest of the world, dealing with some challenges that we face here in the Western U.S. related to drought and water scarcity. We might have to prove that some of those places face water scarcity to Doug, but I think we can do that. Before diving in, though, I wanted to add our thank yous, and to start by thanking co-organizers Lucia and Daniel Connell for being part of the team, and for all of you. Many have traveled long distances, Australia, Brazil, and beyond, to be with us and to share their experiences. So thank you all for doing that, and thanks to the rest of the audience. We've had support to bring this group and convene this group from a number of sources, primarily from the Canadian government, which I'm sure is happy to know that they brought a bunch of people to the U.S., in order to learn some lessons, but has been very supportive of both the workshop that we've had and a related project that Lucia and some other colleagues and I have been working on related to climate adaptation and transboundary rivers. We've also had critical support from the Forum of Federations based in Ottawa, and from a number of universities, including McMaster's Water Network, the Complutense Universidad de Madrid, and the Getches Wilkinson Center. And I'll close my thank yous by mentioning two things. First, this wouldn't happen without the support from Jesper Svensson, who probably is getting some sleep because he's been working around the clock to support this event. And I want to thank both Doug and Sean for really providing the platform for us to come together. I was reminding Doug that about a year ago, after the last March conference, we had a short meeting, and we entered the meeting saying, let's bring some people from Australia and the US to share some lessons. We left trying to bring together a global perspective. And when I ran into him earlier this week showing up, I said, maybe we both had too much coffee that morning. And he said, I don't drink coffee. So it must have been partly my fault. But I think the outcome has been... The outcome has been really enriching, and I have to say I've been in a number of events. I've never had an experience like this with the dynamic of people that we have, and I think that's the strength of the events that we've had together this week. I look forward to building on it. So what I wanted to do now is take a moment to frame the day and provide some context and motivation for our event, and hopefully engage the wider audience in some of the discussions and lessons that we've been learning. We are here really for two reasons. First is the prevalence of drought and water scarcity globally. This is the Global Drought Information System accessed yesterday, and you can see global extent of drought. Many places we're familiar with: Southern California, South Asia, Brazil, and Australia. And the question is, how do you respond to these challenges of drought and water scarcity in a situation of fragmented or divided authority? And we are focusing on the drought experiences in federations because there's a division of authority between states and central levels of government, and that requires a balancing, a reconciliation of national interests or basin interests and the local interests that states represent. How to achieve this systemic sharing of risks and benefits, and how to coordinate the interest and trade-offs that are necessary in these systems. And you see here just a snapshot of two headlines that demonstrate this issue, both here in the western US, the saber-rattling and threats of interstate rivalry among California and Arizona, which dates since the real history of negotiation and conflict in the Colorado River system. And then yesterday we were hearing about the situation in India and in South Asia, where water politics have gone mainstream, have spilled over into national electoral politics. And there's a real challenge of resolving those conflicts. So we wanted to bring together a group of people who can understand the factors and institutions that promote cooperation, resolve conflicts, and build capacity to adapt. And we focus on federal rivers. It's probably worth saying, what are they? And we define federal rivers as major river systems that are either within or shared by a federal political system. And this map demonstrates the global extent and the diversity of contexts in which you find these federal rivers. You have, of the world's major river systems, approximately 60% are within or shared by a federal political system. And you have a range of important regions, large territories like Brazil and India, Australia, the US, and Canada, which are trying to address the challenges of water scarcity and drought in this context. But given the diversity of conditions, you've got federal systems everywhere from South Africa and Sudan to Brazil, India, and the US. It's necessary to drill into how do you understand the responses and adaptations in different contexts and different types of federal systems. And so we are very much taking on the project of answering that question. Our objectives this week and earlier this week were to establish a policy-oriented research agenda and partnership of researchers, practitioners, and PhD students to develop, compare, and learn from case studies of drought adaptation in federations of North America and internationally. And I'll mention that the quality of the people, the network of people is critical because we cannot achieve this comparative perspective and these lessons in one shot. This is a sustained effort to develop a common language, a shared framework and understanding that can help us learn from both our similarities and differences. And that's where we're focusing on advancing our understanding of factors and institutions influencing cooperation, conflict resolution, and adaptive capacity. And we use drought as an entry point into this discussion. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's impossible to separate drought from the wider stressors and tensions, and we've been hearing about both indigenous water justice issues, environmental flows, broader water scarcity concerns that need to be considered in this context. And so it's an entry point because of the stress that drought places on intergovernmental arrangements. In this initiative, we're also seeking to contribute to a wider program, and I wanted to reference the quotation from a former professor here at CU Boulder, that the 21st century will almost certainly be an era of increased global circulation of water issues, inquiry, and expertise, and this will require a shift from largely implicit comparisons to more rigorous comparative analyses. And so it's a shift that we are undertaking, but we're not alone. And I think we all recognize our colleague, our friend, and the dedicated public servant that Doug so eloquently introduced yesterday, Tony McLeod, who is on the trail of Alfred Deakin, who is an important figure in Australia's history because of his trips to South Asia and to the western U.S. and Mexico, and using those trips really to learn from successes and failures before setting up the water allocation system in Australia. And I think it's relevant now because the challenges we face, the rate of change, the pressures are so intense that we will need to have systems in place to learn from experiences of places that are going through these challenges so that we can avoid some of those mistakes and learn from the successes. So we're all following now in Tony's footsteps. The challenge of developing a more rigorous approach, a systematic approach to comparative analysis, is one that I like to describe as the comparative water wars. On the one hand, you have people who say every case is unique, context matters. You got to get into the detail. The devil's in the detail, and you really can't translate or transfer too much across context. And then on the other end of the extreme is the perspective that there are simple blueprints or no, one-size-fits-all solutions. And so we're trying to occupy a middle ground and developing an approach that moves back and forth from a global perspective in a basin-wide perspective. And I'll talk a little bit about the framework and methodologies we use to do that, but I want to situate this in the sense that we are contributing to this agenda by building on momentum on this issue of how to deal with water management in federal systems. And it dates really for centuries, but the most recent push on this question has been started since the Saragossa Water Expo in 2008, when the Forum of Federations convened a group of experts from federal and what they called federal type countries. I have to look a little bit more about the distinction there, but the point was how does water management work in those systems? And simultaneously, you had water organizations like the World Water Council identifying knowledge exchange and transfer in large federal systems as one of its strategic priorities. So in that context, in 2012, Daniel and I organized an event at Oxford to collect a series of case studies on water management in federal rivers. We produced an edited volume. In the same week, talk about coordination challenges, there was an event at Harvard on water federalism, which was really diving into 5 river basin systems and understanding how the challenges and responses had evolved in federal river systems over time. And so you start to have collections of case studies, and that's what they are, collections of case studies. And there are some broad insights, but our next step was to take an effort to zoom into specific types of federal rivers and understand how do you match governance lessons, principles, indicators to specific contexts. And there's an approach described as diagnostic assessment. Like when you go to the doctor, a diagnosis involves an increasingly specific set of questions, identifying what your symptoms are, and then coming up with something that matches that challenge. And that process is used in social science research and interdisciplinary research to understand the fit, the institutional fit of different governance approaches in specific contexts. And we, in 2013 and 14, undertook a diagnostic approach to zoom into semi-arid river systems, principally in advanced economies, and to draw some lessons about how they had dealt with the challenges of climate variability, water scarcity, and drought. And you'll see here that we focused on the Murray-Darling, the Colorado, and the Ebro River Basin of northeastern Spain. And We came up with some initial lessons and also a lot of propositions or questions, which Lucia, Sergio Villamor, who's in the audience, and Adela Schlager, based at University of Arizona, and I have been developing as part of our current work, which is described as TRACE, or Transboundary Rivers and Adaptation to Climate Extremes. And we're focusing in North America. You see the drought monitor. We applied for the grant in 2014, and then all of our study areas simultaneously went into drought. So again, agents of doom. If we write a grant, something bad is going to happen. But what we're doing with North America is we're using it as a laboratory because of the gradient in federal systems from Canada's relatively decentralized system to Mexico's relatively centralized system. And I'll leave it to those in the U.S. to describe the very complex and diverse arrangements we have in place here. But in that context, we selected 2 river basin systems on both of the international borders, the Colorado River and the Rio Grande in the southwest U.S. and northern Mexico, and then the Columbia River and Saskatchewan River systems in the U.S.-Canada border. And we're really using the Rio Grande as our test bed for examining some of these propositions around how to adapt to drought and developing that framework and language for comparison across North America. And just at this time, we were getting into the field and getting momentum. We got asked to go to the World Bank and talk to them about the results of our federal rivers volume, and they were interested in how to deal with some of the projects and implementation issues once they get down to the national level. A lot of people think about the international and the transboundary aspects, but the operational stuff and even some of the more strategic stuff is happening within countries, and they're finding subnational tensions and conflict and cooperation challenges over and over again. I went there and they asked me the question, so what tasks do you decentralize? And I said, all of them. No, I said it depends, because it depends on the context, it depends on the history, but we can come up with a framework for considering and comparing those issues. And we brought the international perspective, drawing in some of the concepts and frameworks we've been developing in North America, adapting that to the wider audience. And that's really what brought us together now. Before turning it over to some of the the lessons that we've distilled from earlier this week, I wanted to provide a few of the conceptual cornerstones of our work. First is how to define federalism. The basic issue is the division of authority between a central and local government, a geopolitical division of authority, but independence within each of those spheres of authority of the central and the subnational governments, and direct accountability of those governments to their citizens. Beyond that, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. Which tasks are decentralized, which are centralized, how are elections run, what are the fiscal arrangements. And so we're trying to take these essential conditions and then look at how the variation in federal design has influenced on adaptive capacity and the other elements that we've talked about. Drought. This is an issue which we could have had probably 10 workshops and still had some discussion around definitions of drought. We know it's an insidious hazard. We know the boundaries are difficult. We know the challenges of translating between the physical and human dimensions of drought. All I'll say here is that it's depicted in this illustration from an article in 2013, that you can think of drought really as variability and deficit specifically in elements of the hydrological cycle that are relevant for rivers, including precipitation, runoff, and soil moisture. And drought leads to impacts when you've got an imbalance between supply and demand. And this illustration shows an undisturbed period, no development, no demand, where you have a threshold level that's been eclipsed in drought for a short period. But then if you add the human impacts and the development and demands, even natural variability, which wouldn't typically be a drought, can lead to eclipsing that threshold and some of the drought or scarcity impacts. Another way of talking about this, which seems less clear, but everyone here would probably find more understandable, is the structural deficit. You know, we have a chronic imbalance between supply and demand, and that is distinct from drought, but related. We'll end with the notion that the drought is a socially constructed crisis. And we find it interesting as this entry point into adaptive capacity and transboundary governance, because droughts pose stress tests for intergovernmental arrangements, exposing underlying weaknesses and, importantly, providing opportunities for reform. And we hear that over and over again about the importance of crisis for reform. And we'll talk a little bit about what we've been learning about these policy windows that open during drought and how they've been used to either improve and enhance adaptive capacity, or in some cases recreate and exacerbate pre-existing vulnerabilities. The final question is around adaptation, another topic. Each one of these conceptual cornerstones could be considered a dedicated workshop in itself, but here we'll focus on the 3 Ns, as some colleagues at the World Bank describe them: institutions, infrastructure, and information systems. And some examples are listed here. What I'll mention as a way of distinguishing federal rivers or the federal aspects of international rivers from international rivers is that with international rivers, you have relatively limited tools, often treaties or river basin organizations that lack binding authority and often capacity. But when you go down to the federal system, you have a framework in place, and that also means that there is a broader portfolio of tools, everywhere from the constitutional provisions that assign roles and responsibilities, the interstate water agreements that bring together states and federal governments to achieve benefits they couldn't do otherwise, the Hoover Dam being a prime example here in the Colorado River context. And then skipping through to some of the institutional approaches during drought, development of river basin organizations with variability management provisions or triggers that can be used to adjust operations and planning during drought conditions. And finally, aspects of information systems, which we think are critical toward building shared understandings within these systems, such as data sharing, joint monitoring, and river system modeling. And many of you are aware of the interesting aspects of that story in the Colorado River, and how an understanding of the river system through modeling has been really useful in identifying openings and flexibility within the system. Our emphasis this week has been trying to look at these mechanisms and the intergovernmental and multi-level governance attributes of adaptation options and adaptive governance. What are some of the challenges of developing effective institutional tools, and what are some of the opportunities in federal systems? Before turning it over to my colleague Lucia Di Stefano, I want to mention that our goal with this development of a research partnership has been to set the foundation for a network where we can sustain and build on this initiative through a bottom-up process, which is to say that each of us has the expertise in our place, and our goal is to try to draw on that expertise within a common framework to develop insights about principles, measurable indicators, and the lessons learned from that process. I just have as an illustration here that global map that we showed earlier, where we have been doing some work, in-depth field work in the Rio Grande, throughout the Rio Grande system, both the US and Mexico portion, to understand how decision makers are coordinating adaptation to drought and water scarcity impacts, and developing a set of questions and coding processes that we want to adapt and extend to other systems so that we can develop that bottom-up perspective. And this differs quite substantially from a lot of these global maps you see where people just go to the books and they read them and say how the system works on the books, but they don't reconcile that with what's happening on the ground. So we're trying to move back and forth between those approaches, developing a data architecture, which is a fancy way of saying a way of sharing knowledge and storing and analyzing the physical, institutional, and socioeconomic data. Our definition of success was that we want to still work together, and we've had a great time this week. I want to now turn it over to Lucia to talk about where to from here and what we've been learning.
Okay, good morning. Well, after this introduction, I talk about what we have been doing during our 2 days of symposium. And first of all, I want to acknowledge the fundamental role of our participants. We convened about over 30 participants, researchers and practitioners from different parts of the world, and together with their expertise, they cover knowledge and experience over 40 rivers across the globe. When we met and started seeing the different case studies, and here you can see the case studies that we explored in this first phase. You can see we have at least one case study in each of the continents, plus some of the contributions were already comparative, so in order to really tap into different types of federations. So when we start comparing ourselves, when we start listening to the stories that the others had to tell, we realized first what Dustin has just said, that There is a lot of diversity in federations. It was almost like a contest. We are extremely decentralized. No one is as decentralized as Canada. And then there was Mike saying, in South Africa, we managed to keep all the power with central government. No, nothing. They have no control. Provinces have no control over water, really. So we could see there was a lot of diversity in how authority is distributed and how authority over water is distributed. But at the same time, it was refreshing for us as organizers to see that challenges and tensions in all these cases were very similar. You could really note why the other people are saying, yes, it is the same in my case. I was telling to the Indian participants, I never know how to pronounce his last name, but Srinivas, yesterday he presented, and I told him, your conclusions about India, if you put instead of India, you write Spain, they apply 100%. It's amazing because Spain and India are so different in many ways, but the challenges related to interaction between being a federal system and water are so similar. So it was really interesting to see that we were hitting in the right place. So out of these 2 days of discussion, there were many considerations, many conclusions, many ideas about what we should do, in which direction we should go with our research. And I have to say, even we had brainstorming sessions even last night with a beer in front of us. So many ideas came out. I just would like to mention 4 of them, and that this doesn't mean they are the only ones. I wanted to just point out those that stand out particularly strong in our discussion. No, this is wrong. So the first one is politics matter, and a lot. It matters in general, but in federal system, the issue of politics comes out very strongly. And we can see that in many cases, the water politics spills over to the national politics. Politicians are increasingly seeing that they can use water to gain votes in the elections, and they can use it to national elections, but also in state elections. So defending the interest of the state over water, they can make sure they gain votes, and people that are opting to become presidents of a federation try to show their interest for the concerns of the different states. So a couple of examples. This is from the example of India yesterday. The current Minister for Water Resources in India that acknowledged when he was at the opposition that really water is a political problem and that it's a way of getting votes. No? The politicians want to play with the nerves of people to get more and more votes. Otherwise, it is very easy to solve this problem. Maybe it's not very easy, but at least easier, right? And here we can see the current drought that is hitting India. We see that water has been transported to some regions using trains, and of course we can have some propaganda to show who is bringing water in that place. Another example is from Brazil. We heard yesterday from Vanessa Pinotti that Brazil has been hit by, especially Sao Paulo region has been hit by a severe drought. And let's say that already in 2014 in Sao Paulo they could see that this drought was unprecedented and at an unprecedented severity, but there were state elections and national elections, so politicians were simply avoiding the problem, but not mentioning drought. They didn't want to talk about restrictions. So Gerson Kellman, he was a retired practitioner who had been the first president of the National Water Agency of Brazil. He had been director of the National Energy Agency, so a big guy. He had no problem in November of 2014 to acknowledge that, to say, hey, the problem here, what messed it up was that we had election this year, so no one didn't want to take the responsibility of saying that there was something wrong. And the funny thing, the irony of the story is that was November, and in January he was asked to come back for retirement and to try to solve the mess in Sao Paulo. So he became the director of the company that is supplying water to Sao Paulo. So now he had to go and talk to politicians about, okay, let's be frank, we have to cut consumption. And just want to say, if you read read the newspapers this day, I've heard that also the water is coming very strongly into the campaign, for example. So apparently the drought in California will be solved with no problem if one of the candidates gains. So we probably won't need to talk about the drought in California anymore. So the second thing that came out is about the role of courts. Really, courts are very present in the disputes between among states, and they are like a double-edged sword. On one side, they can be positive, they can create incentives to collaborate, especially when the outcome of the dispute is not clear, that the parties don't know what will happen. So then parties feel a strong incentive to find an agreement and not letting a judge decide for them. But another case is when states decide to engage in a legal dispute, then it's very easy that a court creates a win-lose situation. Normally when you have a ruling, there is a winner and a loser. And that's not ideal at all, because what you get is that you will have the loser really trying hard to retail and get the right back, right? So what you get is that instead of solving a problem, it just lasts forever. An example from Spain, in 2003, there was a change in the law, and the law required to revise the river basin management plans, and that was seen as a good moment for some of the first step in preparing this plan was to define the boundaries of the river basin district, and that was seen as a good moment by one of the regions that was sharing the basin to discuss, to contest those boundaries. So the two main regions that were sharing the Hooker Basin starting a discussion in court, in the Supreme Court, about what the boundary of the river basin were. And the thing was, of the river basin district, the thing was that in one case, one of the region, so depending on the boundaries, one region had more power than the other. So both of them wanted to find the boundaries that were more beneficial to them. So that was 2003. 2004, there was the first appeal to the Supreme Tribunal. 2011, there was another ruling. 2015, there was another ruling. That was because each time one of the losing region received the news, wanted to go back to the court with new evidence that they were right. So 11 years, and they're still quarreling, right? And another case, just also very recent, in the Rio Grande, is the water dispute between Texas and New Mexico over the water compact that they share. So Texas is claiming that New Mexico is not complying with the compact. They are going to the Supreme Court. This might become a long discussion, a long dispute, and that might have been solved in a better way with dialogue. The third lesson that came out very clearly in our workshop as well was follow the money. And this is some work that Dustin is doing about fiscal arrangements. We saw that if you understand how the money is flowing from the federal government to the states and between states, and how states contribute to common management bodies, you can understand the dynamics, you can understand the incentives that exist to collaborate or not to collaborate. So just an example from Australia. So the federal government, of course, can have a lot of resources and can use those resources to facilitate reaching agreements and also to build capacity. So it's a way of, if the federal government has a clear agenda, wants really to get something, they have the capacity to put money on the table. And at the same time, this is another case I think Dustin will talk about, is the states can complain, can use their lack of contribution to for example, a river basin authority commission as a way of showing their disagreement. This news is about one of the South Australia state retaining some funding from the River Basin Authority of the Murray-Darling, showing that didn't agree what was going on with the plan. And then this is the slide. The last lesson learned, really, we could see that federal government and states, they can both play an important role in water management, water governance in a basin. So what do you think? This one? Well, with this one, right? So we have the federal government can play the role of the gorilla in the closet, acting as a threat, saying so the states governments can say, hey, we need to meet to protect the environment, where to implement this law that are not so positive on the short term for our economy, because we have a gorilla that is waiting for us in Washington, right? And at the same time, when the federal government is trying to impose some policies, and that happens. We saw the example in Brazil, right? That no participation, even if we have mechanisms to hear the voices from the territory, from the local scale, the government the central government can decide just to make decisions that impose a solution, while having a structure with states, with elected representative can help making the local voice being heard very strongly in the national parliament. No, this is not the thing, right? Anyway, so just to conclude, and going back to the slide that Dustin just presented, we've been working very hard for 2 days. We are still having following up meetings, and once we have a couple of nights of good sleep, we will move on and start working on a collaboration that we have designed these days. And the idea is, in addition to build this data architecture and this common framework, I mean, these two activities should help us to identify factors and institutions that enhance cooperation, conflict resolution, and adaptive capacity. And also another point that came out clearly in our conversation these days is that we can find opportunities to learn and to teach to other levels. So we can learn from the transboundary level, how they do. There was a question yesterday about what can the transboundary, how things work in a transboundary, international transboundary basin, teach something about interstate relationship within a country. Yes, I think so, and I think we can also teach some lessons to the international level. And also, we can also learn from other sectors. We can learn not only we can learn from how education is managed in a federal context, how health is managed, how flood management is managed, flood are managed. So we see that we should open up and try to find inspiration from many places. And just to finish, just again acknowledge the work of our participants at the workshop. So thank you. Maybe we just move to the panel. So the rest of the morning is structured. We have 2 panels. The first panel is makes a comparison of the Murray Darling and the Colorado River basins, and then after the break we will have an international comparison, not a comparison, but learning from international experience in federal rivers. So I think we move directly to the panel. Would you like to sit there and let come up and speak? Please.
Trouble picking up your mic.
Let's sit in order so that we don't sit there. I just had to sit in order. Good morning.
I'm going to introduce the speakers, even if I would say that probably none of them needs to be presented. And at the end of the 4 presentations, we'll open the discussion with the audience. Okay. So the first speaker, the first panel. Murray Darling Basin Authority in Canberra, Australia. And prior to joining the Murray Darling Basin Authority, he was involved in the development of the Australian Federal Water Act with the Australian Government, Department of the Environment. I'm going to present everyone so that you just organize yourself. So the second speaker is Daniel Connell, who works at Cranford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. And he has also worked for the Murray Darling Basin Commission. Then we will have Dustin Garwick. Well, he has been already introduced. I don't need to say anything else. And finally, We have Brad Udall, that I think doesn't need an introduction either, right? Because he's playing at home, right? Anyway, he's a senior water and climate research scientist at the Colorado State University. So then please, we start with the first panelist, and then we continue.
Thank you, Lucia and Dustin, for the opportunity to speak today. Again, I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we're meeting and any Indigenous people here today, and those of the Murray-Darling Basin. My instructions today are in 10 minutes to give a provocative talk about, or a stimulating talk, I think is the word, about some of the comparisons between the Colorado and the Murray-Darling Basin. As mentioned yesterday, I spent the fall semester here at the Getchys-Wilkinson Centre a couple of years ago and spent a bit of time trying to get my head around arrangements in the Western United States. It was like watching something upside down in a tumble dryer most of the time to actually try and get my head around the different concepts and language that was used here. And one of the things I think we probably might want to just mention in passing is language can be a barrier in some of these things. While we all sort of speak English, the words we use in different states in Australia and between the two countries use words differently to mean the same thing, or same words to mean different things. So that's always work that needs to be done. Just a very quick recap on the basin, where it is and so forth. Dustin mentioned Alfred Deakin. He came here in the 1880s and learnt from some of the things that were going on in the United States, and indeed some of the things to do and not to do, and also went into Mexico and looking collectively at some of the Spanish legacy in terms of how water rights were administered, came home and introduced legislation into Victoria that put the right, invested all the water in the state of Victoria in the Crown, which is the state. And other states followed suit within about 15 years. So that's the dominant paradigm within Australia. He also ran into and brought back Elwood Mead, who came and administered the water arrangements in Victoria for about 8 years in the early part of last century, and that's another element of the exchange. This is Hume Dam on the Murray River. This is the Murray River heading towards us. This is on the state border between New South Wales and Victoria, and this is what is one of, I think I said yesterday, probably the most important dam in the basin. There are two ones that are a little bit larger. This is what we consider a good dam site and where we've built dams in Australia. It's because we're an incredibly flat country. As I said, the highest point in the country is only 7,500 feet, and as a result, the hills and the sort of, from a pure water supply outlook, the sort of locations for dam sites and our ability to command the landscape is an order of magnitude smaller than that available in the Colorado River system. On Colorado, the storage ratio is something like 4 times the average annual inflow. I don't exactly know what it is on the River Murray system or more generally in the basin, but it's closer to 1. We generally talk about it in terms of annual storages. This dam is, the full supply level is just over 600 feet above sea level, and it's about 1,500 miles from the ocean by river. So it's incredibly flat. I went to Kansas having heard it was supposed to be flat, and I found it quite hilly compared to some of the places, the landscapes we're used to in Australia. The water at this point is divided between the states, New South Wales and Victoria, with an obligation to supply South Australia, and then within those states between particular types of entitlement. And then those entitlements aren't based on first in time, first in right, they're based on a level of seniority in terms of security, and there's generally 2 or 3 classes. The difference we've had as a result of the different ability to command the landscape, if you look at it from that's putting aside all the other issues associated with environmental impacts and so forth, is a scale different. This is the comparison here. I'm not sure the exact height of Hoover Dam, but it looks like about 600 feet to me. I'm not sure what the number is. So what happens in a quarter mile down near Boulder City, Nevada, happens over 1,500 miles in Australia. So how does reliability do? What that means is we've had to live, once our last major dam was finished in the late 70s, we've lived for the last 35 years or so we've developed, I would argue, a sophistication in the water user community of dealing with sub-perfect reliability. And I think that really, after a lot of time working here a couple of years ago, people kept talking about this thing, shortage and shortage sharing, and I felt incredibly silly for several months thinking, what on earth are they talking about? And I looked at things and reread the documents, and finally the penny dropped. What Americans call shortage, we call normal conditions. Where we're continually sharing water that is available, And the notion that we would get perfect water supply to every entitlement in the basin, based on the face value of those entitlements, is something a thing of the past. I rang up a recently retired person who's had, before I came over here a couple of weeks ago, and explained this to him, and he said, oh yeah, we used to do that. And he went through how the model runs that we still do now have all this old code in it that produce estimates of shortfall and shortage and so forth. And he said, yeah, that was really commonly used, and that was the language used in the 70s and 80s. But by about 1990, we stopped calling it shortage and just started moving on and dealing with the sort of rationing system we have available to us under the existing rights structure. I thought that was a really interesting lesson about how the framing we adopted in that period has since fallen into disuse. This, I remember mentioned that the water is divided between the states and then between users within states, and ultimately these sort of curves actually become very well known across the system. This is New South Wales General Security water, which is largely used for rice, not only, and about 1.2 or 1.3 million acre feet on average is delivered under this system of rights. What it shows, the red line shows at the end of the year, remember our years are 12 months, 6 months out of sequence with the Northern Hemisphere, only in about 78% of years do they get the full face value of their right, and it tapers from there. At opening season, only about 10% of years do they start with that. And every month, and sometimes every 2 weeks, that's updated as inflows improve. So people have developed a level of comfort, if you like, perhaps comfort's probably not the right word, at least acceptance and understanding of the way these rights are actually shared and rationed, that has developed up a really good way of they make really good use of the water that's available to them, despite this lack of reliability, or the reliability that is below perfect. I mentioned a few the governance policy in that geographical context. I talked about shortage, structural deficit's another issue. This is a list of some of the things I learned and some of the language, and I've tried to use, in rough terms, the date at which these things were addressed or started to be addressed in Australia. Structural deficit's another one. This person, the recently retired person I mentioned, I talked about what Americans call the structural deficit, where, you know, what is the long-term supply of water as compared to one level of expectation of what could be. And on the view that every person on the River Murray gets all of the water all of the time, compared to what they have come to is available, our structural deficit converts eerily similar through to about 1.2 million acre feet, if you wanted to frame it that way, but we don't frame it that way. Just an interesting level of comparison. Some other things that we've done over the last few years is volumetric conversion. We had area-based entitlements up until a very sharp drought in the early 1980s, when we realised we had to move them across to volume-based entitlements. And that work took many years, but that was the sort of start of that process. Continuous accounting. Some of the accounting that's available now, I'm not sure if intentionally created surplus is the right comparison there, or the ability for Mexico to stockpile its water in Lake Mead under certain conditions. That was something we introduced on the Murray up until in 1989. Before that time, the water used in a given year was as it was, and then the next year the accounts were reset and started again. That was moved to a continuous accounting in the 1980s, the late 1980s. The Appurtenance document, the doctrine, the connection of water and land, that was an agreement was reached in 1994 to address that or remove that appurtenance, and that's often sometimes called unbundling. Beneficial use, how much you use of your water compared to how much you actually might have access. That's been, I've got an approximate sign in front of this. There was a key decision taken in 1996 where all entitlements were taken to be, of a given class, were taken to be equal, independent of the level of activation those entitlements had. Carryover is a thing that actually takes place on an individual basis, where an individual can take their water in a given year or use it in the following year, subject to certain limitations based on the amount of storage available in the amount of space available in the storage, and also water trade, where the reference period for trades is around about 1 or 2 weeks, depending on whether it's in-state or interstate, and generally about 90% of all trades happen in those sort of time frames. I put this as a comparison toolbox. I think it's really important that all lessons are contextual, and you can't just transfer one lesson to another place directly. There's a really good example. In some of our locks and weirs were built by an engineer from the US Army Corps of Engineers, and they're sort of scale models of what you're seeing up in Mississippi, up around Wisconsin. They're like about 1/5 the size. On one of them, a fishway was put in the 1940s, which was really far-sighted. And it was I think they're a great credit. The problem is the American design was for fish that can swim up hills, and Pacific Northwest salmon are pretty good at going up hills, certainly much better than anything we have, because they haven't evolved to deal with that. So the fishway wasn't very serviceable and has since been replaced by one that actually accommodates Australian fish. I think that's a really useful metaphor that you can't just transplant one idea to the other place. And I think these things are best thought of as a toolbox. These are how we've dealt with some of these issues over the last several decades. And I think to the extent any of them or all of them or some of them are useful to, they should be picked and choose. I don't think you can take the Australian experience and just transplant it anywhere else. But I think if there's anything from these things that there is learnings from, please make use of them. And if they're not sensible or applicable, by all means don't. That's just an attempt to try and summarise some of those concepts. That's my remarks, and hopefully that's stimulating or somewhat provocative, I'm not sure. Well, thank you. That's just a nice photo to end with.
So just please, so if you have questions, we are going to have the discussion at the end, so just note down comments, questions about what he has said, because we want to have like an open discussion altogether. So Daniel, please.
Okay. One of the things that I've been reflecting on through the week is this business of language and words. We've been, for example, talking about how Australia hasn't got a system of prior appropriation, and whereas it's obviously a dominant system in the Western USA. But when I reflect on the history of what's been happening in terms of water management in Australia, we've got a de facto system of prior appropriation in the sense that when you look at the various attempts to introduce change within the Murray-Darling Basin system, there's been an extraordinary power for existing interests to pull the debate in their direction. Now, fundamentally, I think that's what the system of prior appropriation does. And the role of irrigation and agriculture in the Australian system, that's a very complex debate, but I think we've got a de facto system of prior appropriation. I think we just call it historical legacy. Also, there's a debate going on about certainty versus reliability. There's a constant pressure that people, when they go to talk to their bank manager doesn't want to know that they've got a percentage of a particular pool that shrinks or contracts, shrinks or expands. He or she wants to know, just how much water have you got every year. So that sort of pressure to try and give a degree of reliability, that's something that is pervasive, I think, in all of our systems. And so there's a constant battle between, you might say, between certainty and between reliability. Certainty, as I would define it, is knowing what you'll get under a given set of conditions. Reliability is a matter of thinking, well, I want to have that amount every year. So those sorts of tensions, I think you can see them in both systems, manifest in different language, debated and thought about in different venues. Okay, I'm talking about drought in the Murray-Darling Basin, a 100-year perspective. Drought has been a very big part of the public policy framework in Australia right from the very beginning because it was such an obvious issue. And as soon as most Australians live on the coast, and as soon as they move away from the coast, it's very much in their face and it dominates the potential for existence. Even on the coast, it dominates the potential for existence. But anyway, I'm going to just talk about it in a longer term perspective. That's a map in various forms you've been seeing in all sorts of ways. This is a quick summary of the policy layers of the last 100 years. Navigation versus irrigation. There was an attempt by South Australia at the end of the system to try and re-engineer the Murray system so that it would be the Australian version of the Mississippi, and Adelaide would become the New Orleans of Australia. as a person who grew up in boring Adelaide, that was a wonderful prospect, but it never happened on any of those fronts. And then for most of the time through the 20th century, basically community development based on irrigation. Community development very much because development was driven by state governments that wanted to expand and develop their states, and governments played a development role that I think hasn't really got the same sort of parallels in the United States. But that's one of the things that produced sort of very strong government control over water policy, the sort of situation where, for example, Alfred Deakin in the 1880s introduces a very strong framework of that, along that line, those lines, and other states followed very quickly. More recently, we've entered into a time of incredible pressure coming from a whole lot of different directions. And you can date that from the 1980s in particular. There's been an intense debate about water in the Murray-Darling Basin since that period, and we've tried various approaches. We're now in the phase of discussing how do we achieve sustainability, whatever that is. But at the very least, it's got some sort of hint of stability about it in terms of not continually eroding the resource base. Well, I think it's a very tortured debate about how we're going to get there. And as I say, what and how, the attempt that we're making at the moment is through the basin plan. Now, after a talk I gave earlier this week, Dustin said to me in a rather bemused voice, because I'd given quite a strong defence of the existing, an explanation of the existing structure that's been introduced into Australia. Dustin said, yeah, but the last presentation I heard you give on that subject, Daniel, I think it was called something like the basin plan and the 10 rejections.
Yeah.
So what's going on? So I'm trying to reconcile those different aspects of my psyche and personality and different perspectives, because I think they've both got a place in this particular debate. Variability in the Murray-Darling Basin, long recognised. Very obvious right from the very beginning. The contrast between Australia and the United States, it's in some ways it's heightened by looking at what's happened in the lower Colorado. As I've had pointed out to me, if you look at a lot of the more recent arrangements in other parts of the United States, there's a much greater acceptance and building into the institutional framework of the fact that there are variable flows and you've got to have institutional processes that take account of that. It's when you look at an arrangement made in 1922 in a very short time span that you get a much more rigid approach. But this variation was very obvious from the very beginning in Australia, and it shaped the institutional systems that were introduced. Federation made a very big impact on the way in which water was managed in Australia, in particular for South Australia. South Australia was the state at the end of the system that essentially was continually left out. It was a weaker state anyway. Victoria and New South Wales dominated, and still do, what happens in the Australian Federation. And South Australia has continually worked hard to try and get other ways of putting leverage on those upstream states. And that was the main reason, probably the main reason, it was for why they went into the Federation. After the Federation, there was a very confused debate in the Constitution about how water issues would be managed, but basically it was very unclear. And as a result of that, creative confusion, we basically got cooperation, reluctant cooperation, and that's what we've had for the last 120 years. The interstate water sharing formula, it's fundamentally proportions of available flow. You'll find all sorts of elements where there's an attempt to get very specific about the numbers, but there's always an escape clause, whether you're talking at the interstate sharing level or whether you're talking about the sort of situation that confronts the individual extractor, irrigator, urban user, whatever. Essentially, it's quite rigid most of the time. South Australia getting 1,850 gigalitres. The conversion of a gigalitre I think is roughly about 900,000 acre feet. I think that's about right. Something like that, 850, 900. But in dry years, you have a system of special accounting that comes in where the three states basically divide whatever's available in Newham Dam. But this particular system, it was quite robust, very political, different layers, based on parallel legislation passed in 6 parliaments. It worked quite well for most of the 20th century, but it was quite very heavily administrative, top-down, and over a period of time, particularly in the early 1990s, early 2000s, basically the system ground to a halt. There are a whole lot of factors that came together to produce this deadlock, and there are a number of different responses that could have been made to that deadlock. The Commonwealth government was clearly the government that was in a position, the only government that was in a position to really break the deadlock. It was the only government that had jurisdiction over the whole region. It was the only government that had serious money that it could throw at the problem. So those particular things gave it a key role. Now, as I say, there were a number of different ways it could have gone, and the way in which it did go was to the Water Act and the and to the Basin Plan. But at the same time, as all of those pressures were coming to bear, they've been building up for 20 years, we had the most extreme drought that we'd had in the recorded record. And it was in many ways, it was a good test of the way in which the fundamental system worked. And essentially, what happened when the pressure was really on, the fact that it was Australian water is fundamentally controlled by governments, and that there are all sorts of processes that allow public policy priorities to be asserted on the system, that effectively enabled Australia to pull through that drought. Using a number of other devices, water markets have been coming in for sort of 10 years or so before that. That played a very big role in equalising the pain across the basin and allowing water to move to places where it could be used to make more money. As a result of that, the economic impacts of the drought were minimised. The environmental impacts were, on the other hand, they were very, very severe. One of the things that I think happened as a result of the combination of dealing with a crisis and using the market to deal with it is that there was very severe environmental impact. And looking at all of that, combined with those longer-term pressures that I was talking about over the last 2 or 3 decades, clearly we're at a crisis point, and it came together in the Water Act 2007 and 8. Now, the Water Act was a very big, brave decision, and in political terms, brave is and courage are words that are used with a number of different meanings. But just to sort of look at some of the components in the Water Act, it summarised many elements of which there was quite a lot of agreement within Australian society, and it brought in some where there was more dissent. But essentially what the Water Act involved was the use by the Commonwealth Government of the power that it had. Basically it was funding power. The actual legal power, highly contested, but it had the money. So it was a case of money talks, and they used that to push through the Basin Plan. And so essentially the national government took control over policy, and the idea was the national government would control policy and that the state governments would control implementation through subplans. Now, they'd have a lot of flexibility. They're given a lot of flexibility in the way in which they develop those subplans, and they're in the process of doing that now. The Water Act was passed in 2007 and changes in 2008 with the change of government, and the Basin Plan itself was approved, something like near unanimous approval in the National Parliament, and that indicates the strength of consensus. There is a very strong consensus to the core elements of what's involved in the Basin Plan, and that was shown by that very strong support. However, there's extreme pressure coming to bear on the Basin Plan, and so we have to think about, will it survive, and if not, what then? The Basin Plan, as I indicated by referring to that presentation that Dustin heard a couple of years ago, a lot of compromises, a lot of tension. It was a place, everything was coming together into one plan, so you can imagine that every stakeholder, every interest group, put an enormous amount of effort into trying to pull the plan in this way and that way. And so, it was the result that you have in a democracy. It was the best deal you could get under the circumstances. And it was a much better deal than a whole lot of other things that were on the table. But there were a lot of very fundamental compromises. However, I was arguing then, I argue now, one of the shaky foundations is the idea of Commonwealth control of policy and the states controlling implementation. You basically, it involved moving away from a century of what you might call confederate management, where the institutional structure was basically created by parallel legislation, identical legislation passed in 6 parliaments, which obviously gave opt-out potential for particular jurisdictions. But at the same time, it gave them a sense of, well, we can get out of this if we don't like it. And so on that basis, they all kept working together, reluctantly, but they did. That's the nature of a political system as we know it. But the movement towards a purchaser-provider system created a situation where my time has expired. Okay, essentially what I'm saying is that we should be thinking about this in a way that moves away perhaps from the idea of comprehensive planning and thinks about water planning from the point of view of a barroom brawl. If you're a middle-sized person in the middle of a barroom brawl, should you make yourself a big target with a plan, or should you get really smart and think about all sorts of nifty, shifty ways? I think that's the alternative way we have to go. I think we should strengthen monitoring and auditing and information in the public, and I think we should bring in new stakeholders and give them a reason for taking part, and basically, by empowering communities, stakeholders with information and restructuring the design, I think we should try and survive the barroom brawl in a smarter way. Okay.
Okay, hello everyone. Hello again, everyone. I'm going to be speaking about the role of water markets and the perspectives that we can learn about building flexibility into water allocation systems in the context of drought, climate change, climate variability. And the headline message from some work that I've done in the Western US and Australia is to focus on water governance as the servants of sound governance, not the master. And the aspect of that in federal systems is that you need to focus on the interface between water markets and basin governance, which are obviously interdependent, but are often analyzed separately. Title slide here is the view upstream from the border between the US and Mexico on the Colorado River, and I mention it because the person who took the picture from an airplane is sitting in the back there, Amy McCoy. I also mention it because the journey to Australia and some comparisons with Australia started with some time that I spent in the Colorado Delta during 2004 when the drought was intensifying, and I was interested in the potential of market mechanisms to restore the Delta. When I went to my PhD committee and mentioned that comment, that topic, I was told it's both the most overstudied problem in the world and it's hopeless. And for those of you in the room who know the story of Minute 319 and some of the advances that happened in 2012 in the flood pulse that was delivered in 2014, you know that things can change quickly. But I wanted to learn from other regions that had confronted similar challenges. I'm going to walk through that journey in the context of the Colorado, the Columbia, and the Murray-Darling, 3 rivers which share a condition of river basin closure, which is to say that downstream commitments aren't met and there's a structural deficit. And yesterday we learned about the Kenny Index of Water Scarcity, which shows that Columbia and Canada don't count. But you'll see from this picture of a river, or a tributary more specifically in the Columbia Basin, that there's chronic dewatering in these tributary systems. They may be thought of as a microcosm for some of the situations that we're looking at for basins as a whole. So in this context, water markets are back in fashion. In the mid-2000s, it's fair to say that water markets might have been viewed as passé, but with the scarcity, the drought conditions prevalent, water markets are being viewed as increasingly important, and this is taken from the Water Funder Initiative, a consortium that's developing the strategy for philanthropic investments in the Western U.S. and other contexts. And you see water markets are key to the action plans and the priority strategy. And you have these terms like shaping healthy water markets. And I think it's a maturing view of markets that emphasizes the dependence on governance. And Australia has the answers. They have provided us with a model where up to 40% of water allocation, water is in a given year is traded, water used in a given year is traded. And it's an active market. And you see that the Western U.S. and other places in the world are looking to their experience to draw lessons. And I would say that even recently, the view of the market in Australia is based on a fairy tale version of the market being developed in a single setup period, prices used to convey scarcity, motivating reallocation to maximize benefits of water use. And the reform is based on a series of institutional steps, capping water supplies, allocating water, and providing trading rules. And the notion is once you get the institutional framework, you can get out of the way and have efficiency. But in practice, these water market developments in Australia have depended on the parallel investments in the basin governance initiatives that we've been learning about. So how to achieve the miracle of the market in Australia? One of the main points to mention is that during the Millennium Drought, you saw the flexibility and the adjustment that was possible through the market. And one of the studies by Mac Kirby and colleagues at the Commonwealth Government's Scientific Research Organization was that water availability was reduced by up to 60 to 70%, but the gross value in irrigated agriculture was only reduced by 20%. And you can see in this red zone the years in 2006 and 2007 when those dramatic reductions occurred. But sitting to the right, I think the important part in the federal context is a quite striking movement of water between states, interstate trading, including 550 gigaliters or 446,000 acre-feet of water moving from New South Wales to Australia and lower parts of the Victorian Murray. So that puts in context, thinking about Arizona or Nevada or California being willing to make that kind of transition. And that became possible because the development of the market was constantly being adapted and reformed based on experience to address some of the obstacles and unintended impacts of the reform and to address some of the concerns of states associated with this process. So when I finished a book comparing the experiences of the Western U.S. and Australia last year, I was trying to translate some of the main messages for a broader audience and put a piece in Water Deeply, and they did the headline. It's not a surprising lesson, but it is an important one, that politics matter. And we talked about language, and I think this translates. That when we talk about some of the reactions to the basin planning process, you had concerns because some of the irrigators perceived that these changes in basin planning would cause some losses, and it gets to the point of the win-lose perspective, and then those vested interests are resisting those changes. So unlocking the past and addressing some of those vested interests means recognizing the political economy of water markets, which is to say that many of the costs of developing markets are localized, concentrated, and immediate. And some of the benefits, particularly when you extend out to the environment, are longer term and distributed. And so there's a need to reconcile by engaging vested interests at all levels. And the picture that you saw before, I should say, is the leading edge of that pulse flow delivered to the Colorado Delta in 2014. And that was the product of this trajectory of consensus building and engagement happening in the Colorado River, which is reflected nicely in the record of decision for the coordinated management of Lakes Powell and Meade to deal with shortage conditions, and describing the unique and remarkable consensus that emerged in the basin and some keywords that are taken from the textbook of adaptive management: preserving flexibility, providing short-term rules that can provide an opportunity to learn from experience. And in terms of the federal-state relations, the role of the federal government as a facilitator, not dictating the informed decision-making and cooperation by states and other stakeholders in the basin. In the Murray-Darling context, the basin planning process that we've been hearing about involved extensive consultation, including learning from the initial backlash associated with the release of the guide to the basin plan in 2010 and 11. These are just some statistics to show the range of engagement happening through community meetings, roundtables, and so forth. But it's to emphasize that this consultation is ongoing. There's no single setup period in getting out of the way for the markets. It requires that sustained governance capacity. As recently as March of 2016, South Australia was concerned and protesting some of the reports that coming out of the Murray-Darling Basin planning process. And that's required that this engagement continue, and here you see in the 2014-15 period the emphasis on ongoing engagement in a range of settings. So engaging these vested interests and building the basin frameworks can learn lessons from the Columbia Basin. Again, here you can see the Washington State, one of the 4 U.S. states in the Columbia Basin, where there's been the development of an innovative market-based program for river restoration called the Columbia Basin Water Transactions Program. It's a public-private partnership. And I've done some work there evaluating the evolution and performance of these market programs in specific catchments or subbasins within the 4 states on the U.S. side. And you see evidence of pockets of success, but coordination deficits, challenges of scaling up. Performance of these markets in terms of water recovery, the transaction costs, the overall capacity varies almost as much within states as across them, because it depends on the one hand on local institutions, on the other hand building those cross-level partnerships with state and federal entities as well as other stakeholders in order to bring the resources and the authority to make this work happen at a larger scale. So success is hinged strongly in collaborative approaches. Crises can be harnessed in this context, particularly during drought conditions and addressing land use change, for example, the need to mitigate the impacts of new residential development in previously rural areas. No silver bullet in terms of the form these partnerships take, other than the need to engage both horizontally across stakeholders on the ground and vertically across levels. And also the need for a long-term perspective. We hear that over and over again this week, that these kinds of partnerships and governance arrangements don't develop overnight. And it's also important to say that they can be unraveled quite quickly if trust and other types of steps aren't taken. The final point that I'll mention is around the Murray-Darling experience and how these 2 processes of market reforms and basin governance reforms are becoming increasingly coordinated. And the message here is that scaling up takes time, capacity, and integration. This chart would take a little bit of time to discuss, but basically what it's showing in the blue and the red bars is the growth in temporary and permanent trading over the period since the mid-1980s, when that unbundling of water and land rights really began in earnest. Parallel set of reforms becoming increasingly coordinated at the national level. And you see during the Millennium Drought and with the environmental water recovery process, the expansion of water trade, and having those reforms in place before the drought and in response to lessons from previous droughts was able to build that flexibility. But in the gold bar, you also see the trends in federal expenditures associated with environmental water recovery and some other steps associated with salinity, and showing the correlation of expenditures rising during that time period. And so the point is these aren't mutually exclusive. They're interdependent aspects of market reform and basin governance, and they're becoming increasingly tightly coupled, as you see in the small snapshot of the basin plan. In 2014, new water trading rules were specified in that basin plan, providing coordinated and consistent ways of reporting on water trading, including price information in the basin context. And so the final thing I'll say is that these coordination and integration efforts are both formal and informal. They involve the authority, but also a range of working groups and entities that are happening at other scales to address some of these challenges and opportunities of water reform. That also illustrates that these partnerships involve the sharing of costs, and that sense that we heard from Daniel earlier in the week, that these federations are there as a way of trying to provide a systematic sharing of costs and benefits within these regions. And so Lucia mentioned some ongoing work about fiscal arrangements following the money. Understanding the sources and flows of money gives us a strong indicator of how the federal and states are going to be working together. And I'll just emphasize one point here, which is that we heard earlier about the infusion of money that was used to facilitate cooperation in the environmental water recovery process and pay irrigators for their water entitlements to dedicate for environmental purposes and to build infrastructure efficiency schemes to do that as well. What you see here in this chart is taken from annual reports of the Murray-Darling Basin Commission and its successor, the Authority, and it shows that states and federal entities have both shared the costs of providing this basin authority and this basin coordination, but that the changes over time can provide a nice indication. And I'll just emphasize in 2013, as one sign of the resistance and concerns, New South Wales reduced its contribution to the operating budget by half. And you see this as an example of how states can use their money and their contributions as bargaining power, even if some of the authority or functions have been moved centrally. And that's illustrated. There's kind of a contagion effect where New South Wales' decision led to some threats by the state of South Australia to match suit. I want to end with the notion that if you're looking for something that's transferable, the no regrets option is investing in transparent information to develop a shared understanding of these systems across scales. And Australians have done a tremendous job in building what they've described as environmental intelligence, which I think is a fantastic term because it shows us the difference between just saying let's get more data to looking at data that is a part of an information system used for decision making. And part of the relatively small trickle of the funding that was dedicated in the 2007 and 8 reforms, large by absolute terms but small relatively, was a $450 million commitment over 10 years to strengthen that environmental intelligence and develop a national water account. And this water account tracks things like water use and water availability, but also trading information and information on water entitlements, again, feeding into a shared understanding of the system and a coordinated information system. I think the parallels with things like the Colorado River simulation system and new stakeholders and actors becoming engaged in that technical capacity has been an analog or a comparable experience here in the Western U.S. context. So I guess going forward, I think that it's useful to learn from both principles and on-the-ground experiences and think about how we might reflect on this in our own context. And thank you for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Well, good morning. My name's Brad Udall. Under the theme of language is important, I want to share a story about a trip I made to New Mexico a few years ago to talk about the Colorado River Compact. And I pulled up behind a car that in any normal state would have had a bumper sticker that said "Carpe Diem, seize the day." And I learned that morning that the New Mexico version of that saying is "Carpe Mañana." And that's actually a pretty good theme for my talk because it's all about seizing tomorrow and what we're going to do about climate change and how these two basins have operated, I would argue, very differently with respect to the same common thread. So just quickly, I think everyone in this room knows that climate change and the water cycle are joined at the hip. The water cycle exists really to move energy around. That's what the Earth is doing with the water cycle. It happens to move water as an artifact of that energy movement. If you add more energy to the planet, as we're doing right now in large quantities, you're going to change that cycle in really fundamental ways, and you end up on the short end of the stick on all aspects of the water cycle. You end up with too much water. You end up with too little. You have the wrong timing. You got the wrong form and the wrong quality. You all know that, but it's important to state it as a part of this little short talk. So I've got 3 slides on climatological issues in the Murray-Darling, 3 slides in the Colorado River, and then a few conclusions. So here's going back to 1892, River Murray natural flows. And you can see the 3 drought periods there. And look at the most recent one. It is significantly worse, right? It looks significantly worse. And that's the same story in the Colorado River Basin. And there are a couple inputs. So here's the rainfall anomaly. On about that same time scale, the black line there is a 15-year moving mean. And look at that recent period from about 2000 to 2015 or so. That 15-year moving average, it's not as low as it is back over there in 1940 and 1930, is it? And yet that drought was worse. Might also note the huge flow there in, I think it's 2011 in the Murray-Darling Basin. Too much, right? Climate change generates too much. But what about temperatures? And this is the issue here, right? We're looking at 1 C, 2 Fahrenheit, even almost 1.5 C, higher temperatures in that recent drought period. And that's the connection here that's making these droughts worldwide so much worse. Colorado River has a very similar story. There's upper basin natural flows going back to when we first started gauging the annual flows. There are faint lines. You've got a linear trend in red dashed, and then what's something like maybe a 40-year average. And there's a 1950 drought there in sort of brown, and then the most recent drought. And these droughts are comparable. They're about 20% decline. The most recent one's slightly worse by about 1%. Ask, well, what went on with precipitation? And the answer is sort of similar to what happened in the Murray-Darling Basin. The precipitation decline recently cannot explain the decline we've seen in the Colorado River. It only explains half of the decline we've seen in the Colorado River. And so what's the answer? Again, it's temperatures. And within the Colorado River Basin, about 1 degree C additional warming over that historical period. Going on here is really simple. Increased evapotranspiration. When it gets hotter, things evaporate more. Plants use more water, land surface evaporates more, and you get reduced runoff. It's really pretty simple. And so the US and Australia have gone about dealing with this, I would argue, in a very different way. These are 2 articles that appeared in a journal, I think, called Water. And in fact, some of Dan's colleagues are on the bottom article. And Tony McLeod's, you can see his name here on the upper one. And it was a little discussion within Australia about how the Basin Plan, how the Water Act should really deal with climate change. And was it adequate or not? And it's interesting that within Australia, they can have this kind of discussion. What is the proper trade-off between consumptive use, effectively, and environmental purposes? That's what these 2 articles dealt with. And I found it a very engaging, active, open discussion about were they doing the right thing around planning for climate change. Within our system, in the Colorado River, here's the operable clause that people so far have been operating on. It's a 1922 Colorado River Compact Clause 3D that some of us think might control how we would deal with climate change were nothing to talk about. And this deals with this 75,000 or 75 million 10-year running average delivery that the upper basin is supposed to make to the lower basin. And many legal scholars, including David Getches, who was the dean of this law school, and others, for a long time called this a delivery obligation. The upper basin states have argued vociferously that it's not an obligation, and they point to a really important word, or series of words. The states of the upper division, so that's the 4 upper basin states, will not cause the flow of the river at least vary to below an aggregate of 75 million acre feet for every period of 10 consecutive years. So if climate change is the cause and not humans, the upper basin states say this doesn't apply. But how do you prove that it's climate change or not climate change? Well, we have no way to deal with this right now. What we have done in the US, and arguably this is a very good thing, is we have a federal law passed in 2009 called the Secure Water Act. And it forces our federal government to issue a series of reports and planning and modeling studies every few years to try and at least give people an idea of what the future looks like. Much like, I would argue, in Australia, this study overly focuses, or at least the press and the water folks have overly focused on median results. And let me just note that that lower article actually made that point exactly. Too much focus on median results. It's great. It's a great series of inputs. but it's clearly not enough. And so I want to actually leave you all with a question for the day. And it goes like this. Is it time for the Colorado River Basin states to discuss where the flow risk associated with climate change should fall outside of that 3D clause, which clearly cannot work? Clearly, you cannot put the entire onus of climate change flow reductions on the upper basin states in the Colorado River. And my simple and somewhat provocative answer is absolutely yes. I mean, we can't, this will not work in the long run. Everybody right now seems to think that this structural deficit is just an overuse issue, and it's kind of a drought issue, and we've really focused on, oh yeah, it's an overuse issue. And clearly when, in 1968, when the structural deficit was put in place, people realized that ultimately it would not work as the upper basin consumed their full share of the river. Nobody thought about climate change at that point. But the deficit in the Colorado River right now, this drought, it's a 20% decline. It's a 3 million acre-foot decline over the last 15 years per year. Half of that, I'll make the case, and this is unpublished work that I'm working on with Jonathan Overpeck at the University of Arizona, half of that is due to temperature, about 1.5 million. That's the size of the structural deficit. In the absence of climate change, we would not be having the discussion about the structural deficit that we're having right now. It's pretty simple. We would ultimately have that discussion, but climate change has forced it upon us. And the scary thing about climate change is that it's a moving target, right? We love to solve problems based on the facts that we can see at the time. But those temperatures are headed up. They will continue to rise, and the flow reductions that we've seen in the Murray-Darling and that we've seen in the Colorado River because of temperatures will continue to increase. And that makes solving this problem even more imperative on multiple levels. I want to leave you with a statement that I was reminded of yesterday, and it's a great, and it actually is a nice ending to what Dustin was talking about. And he was talking about all the money that the Australians were able to throw at this problem. And I think in the midst or towards the end of World War II, the UK was in a world of hurt financially. And Winston Churchill one day said to his advisors, he said, "Gentlemen, we have run out of money. Now we must think." And the analog to that is gentle people, right? 21st century, gentle people, we have run out of water. Now we must think.
It's a good quote.
So thank you very much to the four panelists. Well, now the floor is open. Now it's your turn. Ask questions, comments.
I just have a question, I think, for Tony and Dan about the environmental impacts of the market after, I think Dan mentioned it was very severe. And then Tony, yesterday, I think you mentioned that in the 2012 water plan, there's a provision for sustainable take. And so I'm wondering if the sustainable take is addressed at fixing that environmental damage, and who pays for those benefits. I mean, before presumably, cities or whomever were paying, or whoever were paying farmers for that water. Who's paying for that environmental benefit in the 2012 plan?
Okay, there's a little bit in that question. The 2012 Basin Plan sets out sustainable diversion limits for surface water and groundwater across the basin to come into effect from 2019, so we're in a transition to that level. In surface water, the reduction that has been placed from 2009 levels in the plan is 2.2 million acre-feet, or 2750 gigalitres in the language we use. The transition to those lower figures, the federal government is committed to finance the adjustment to those lower figures, so it's spending the exact figures in the order of about 14 billion Australian dollars, which is closer to about 10 billion US dollars over a 10-year period, to actually buy water directly from willing sellers or invest in infrastructure savings, and with some of the either in a network system or on farm, with some of the water actually accruing to the environment through that process. So in some ways, the government's making use of market mechanisms to actually recover the water. So as we speak, about 2,000 gigalitres, 2 million cubic metres, 2,000 million cubic metres, or about 70% of that recovery effect has already been completed, and the remaining period through to 2019 is the time to recover the remainder, along with an adjustment mechanism, which I can talk about if you like, but that's a secondary thing in relation to this question. So the government is paying for that transition.
If I could just add to that, water sales occur within a context where environmental impacts of the sales are taken into account. The water market sort of operates on an annual market and then a long-term market for the fundamental entitlement. The marketing for the fundamental long-term entitlement is much smaller and much more restricted, a lot of attention paid to it. The biggest issue long-term has been salinity in the Murray-Darling Basin. And so sales that, for example, take water out of areas where there's low salinity to areas where there's high salinity are severely restricted. Tony would know more about the details about this than I, but basically salinity and acid sulfate soils are the biggest immediate environmental concerns, and there's actually a fairly strong institutional framework around dealing with those impacts.
Sorry.
So I had a question stemming from Brad's presentation. Really enjoyed it. Brad focused on Article 3D as an interstate flow obligation under the Colorado River Compact. There's a second one too, Article 3C, that deals with how flows are going to be contributed to Mexico to satisfy the United States' treaty obligation. And Brad's entirely correct that as far as legal scholars go, one of the major issues has been how do these provisions allocate risk as between the upper basin and lower basin, right? I'm wondering if in the Murray-Darling Basin context, you have interprovincial flow obligations similar to those and that have posed similar risk allocation issues or tensions, and if so, how they're dealt with.
There are interprovincial or interstate flow obligations. Probably the highest profile one is the one between New South Wales and Victoria on the River Murray system into South Australia, which is 1850 gigalitres a year. Unless we're in an extreme drought. 1850 gigalitres translates to 1.5 million acre feet, which I think is a nearly similar number to the number between the US and Mexico. They haven't really created the tensions that in the way you framed them, in part because the level of storage in the Murray-Darling Basin is significantly less than that in the Colorado River system. So the ability, should it have been desired, the ability to regulate down to 1.5 million acre feet across the frontier or across the border is just never been there. The average flow into South Australia, and averages are always dangerous in a system with high variability, but they sort of frame the basic size of the problem is normally 3 to 4 times that. We've also found that as a result of even that level of regulation, there's been a decline in the lower part of the river system, sort of the lower part of the River Murray system, well above South Australia, but certainly into South Australia, that's led to some of the motivations for returning a further 2.2 million acre feet into the river system for environmental outcomes. So it hasn't really come to that pressure. Probably more specifically, there's this thing called special accounting in the Murray when under extremely dry circumstances there's this level of sharing that changes from the normal sharing. This was designed into the system decades ago. When that comes about, these things I wouldn't describe them as tension, but they're certainly closely focused discussions about making sure that those shares actually operate. And in the 2006-7 drought, we had also some modifications to even those shares over a 2-year period to actually ensure that there was enough water for town water supplies between the different states, because a straightforward operation of that sharing would have seen some towns go dry, and there was adjustments made to that sharing by consensus in order to get through those particularly sharp circumstances.
The South Australians, it should be noted, refer to themselves as the Mexicans on occasion.
The gentleman on the back. Oh, no, sorry, the gentleman on the back. I have noted down there was another.
I have this hugely powerful electronic device. Excuse me. Two quick things. One comment, Brad Udall has been sending this message on climate change in these seminars for 10 years. And just for those of you who don't live in the States, there are still a lot of non-believers. I don't know what to say. Putting that aside, however, Dustin, talk about water markets and how they will work with state laws determining water ownership, water appropriations in states like Idaho, where they pass laws saying you can't ship very much water out of this state and sell it without the express permission of the legislature. In Australia, it appears they have a federal system that helps with the marketing. Do you think state by state water markets will work, or do you think we need to have a broader perspective in the West?
Well, the short answer is yes, both. It's state by state. I think context matters, and I think I'd back up and say that the role water markets play is going to depend on the kind of existing enabling conditions around state frameworks and whether adjudications have occurred and other kinds of steps are in place. And so, water markets may have a role to play, but it shouldn't be assumed that they're going to be relevant to solving a given state's problems, let alone the interstate water trading. As far as a broader perspective, I think we're seeing that happen in the Colorado River Basin, where there are a lot of innovative agreements to, we've heard yesterday from Amy McCoy's presentation, to try to think of the system as a system and to increase the reliability of the system so that all the people benefit from it. And that's a broader perspective. So I think the answer is, to the first question, it depends on the state. It depends on the enabling frameworks in place in the state. And even within states, one of the biggest comments that I often make is that people tend to focus on what the state framework looks like, but it varies a lot within states. And you can look to an example in Oregon, the difference between the Klamath and the Columbia Basin portion of Oregon is quite strikingly different in terms of the enabling conditions for markets, the role that they play, the other kinds of wider governance frameworks in place. And then as far as the second question, yes, a broader perspective is needed, and necessity is going to be the mother of innovation.
So one thing that often gets overlooked in the Western U.S. when we look at those Australian water markets is you do not have municipalities competing for water in the Murray-Darling Basin. All those cities are outside the basin, all the big cities, and only Adelaide can take 200,000 acre-feet a year out of that Murray-Darling system, which is roughly the size of the Colorado River, a fairly small amount. Melbourne also had a pipeline. But you don't have that dynamic, right? And that's an enormously important dynamic here in the American West with these voracious cities going after ag. And that removes an element of contention that I think is important to acknowledge.
Yeah.
All of you have talked about problems that are the consequences of problems from decisions that were made in the past. And I wonder if at some stage when you've been doing this work, you've thought back and thought, gee, if we had our time again, we probably wouldn't have done X, Y, or Z. And I guess I'm coming from an area where we're starting to look at replicating the sorts of decisions that have been made in some of these other basins. And I just wonder what advice you would give if you had, say, one tip to an area that's about to start on more intensive water use and more intensive agricultural development. What advice would you give to that area in terms of how can we avoid the mistakes that have been made elsewhere?
Well, in a headline, I would say that the solutions are temporary, the consequences are lasting, and a lot of path dependency is one way of describing this challenge of choices taken in the past that have deferred consequences and can lead to lock-in. As far as a practical suggestion, I think taking an adaptive approach, and an interim cap was developed in the Murray-Darling system. The sustainable diversion limits have this adjustment process. There's constant iteration. I think the danger comes in thinking about permanence.
I think a key element to try and deal with what you're talking about is public information, public involvement, activating stakeholders, and basically creating a higher level and a wider range of understanding. I can't see any other option as a way of the normal suspects controlling the normal processes.
Mike?
Tony, you looked as if you were going to...
I know.
Just to take... Oh, sorry, Tony.
I know. I just think that the other points are valid in the context. I think it's working through the sustainability considerations that we're only now addressing. I think just on that, looking at past mistakes, I think it's important to recognise that these they might be viewed by that in hindsight, but they were actually done with broad public support, and these were it reflected the values of the prevailing values in the society at that time. So to actually talk about them as mistakes, I think is a luxury of hindsight in some respects. I think I often say as governments are doing or public servants are doing what they've always been doing, which is translating broad public value systems into the way systems are administered. What's happened is as those value systems have changed, the management styles have changed as well.
Just referring right back to the start of the sort of high-level sort of features that the chair put up there on the screen, just politics and courts and money and the role of feds and states. I didn't see anything about the nature of institutions, and I'm not hearing too much about the nature of institutions. During the discussions we've had, it's been emphasized that relationships are important, that trust is important, which is built between people informally as well as formally. We know that the collection of data and information over a long period is important and it needs to be trusted. And we know that we need to have some sort of continuity over a long period because these are long period challenges that we have. And designing institutions to function in that kind of framework is quite difficult. There's a large literature, we talk about the successful developmental states in a developing country context and identify what's called embedded autonomy, where you have public servants who are kind of protected from politics but are still trusted by politicians and allowed to function. Now, I know that's kind of difficult in a country where the presidential candidates feel perfectly free to kind of say that the judiciary isn't doing what it should be and should be changed. But actually, maybe that makes the point. If you allow your institutions to become the victim of the political pressures, you're almost certainly going to be less functional than you might be. And I think it is a lesson that comes out that you do need to protect your institutions, you do need to give them a status, and you do need to demand performance of them. And some of the Murray-Darling, I always enjoy the picture of the farmers burning the plan, Some of the Murray-Darling examples are where that trust broke down or people didn't feel sufficiently included. Sure, you can buy your way out of the conflict in the end if you've got $10 billion in the budget, but a better way is to try and make the institution work more effectively. And I'd like to hear some reflections about the quality of the public institutions and what's being done to protect and even build them.
Could I lead off on that? I think in the case of the Murray-Darling Basin, it's fundamentally been a success story over 100 years, and I think a large part of that has been the institutional processes, which have been very conservative, but fundamentally have kept a high level of public trust through that period, and so they've been able to manage. The business of institutional design was what I was referring to when I was being critical of the Water Act and the way in which it created a purchaser-provider model, a dominant Commonwealth government role for controlling planning, with states doing implementation. I think institutionally it's a flawed design. And what I was talking about at the end, trying to work out ways in which you basically can be effective in a highly contested public space where it's unrealistic to expect to be able to control that in a top-down way, and you have to think about ways in which you can be effective over a long period of time in a contested space. That's very much about institutional design. But the situation of public servants being able to work with some protection, which I agree is absolutely crucial for long-term sort of effective management, it has to be based on a fundamentally strong relationship with the public and essentially shared values. And that's why I'm continually emphasising the importance of information, the importance of being active, getting stakeholder groups, a wide range of stakeholder groups involved. It's not to create an enormous mess. It does do that. But fundamentally, I think it creates a better foundation for long-term water management.
I can just say, it would be nice then to talk about the barman and who designs the bar as well as the brawl.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll perhaps stylise it as contested policy debate, so I'll use it in more neutral terms. They certainly are part of it, and I think it's core to water that these debates will be contested. I think in a federal system, I would argue that the level of intervention by the federal government is appropriate in the sense that, given across the entire basin, the water use and economic opportunity, environmental outcomes have been distributed through the basin plan, but we haven't taken direct control or overwhelming control of the planning decisions of the states. And also the states are still free within the framework that has been specified by the basin plan to do other things and continue to advance different agendas or different innovations at the state level within an overall framework. I think that's important. And the other thing is, while the Commonwealth or the federal government has legislated using its own powers in order to actually create this thing, you don't get anything done anywhere in water without cooperation and trust and relationships. You've got to still deliver the sort of outcomes by working with people and with the legislative backing of, be doing stuff that's legislatively valid, but you've got to do it working with people. So while we've got with water resource plans that are brought forward by a particular state to marry up to the basin plan requirements, the authority's view is to assess those plans and provide advice to the minister to actually accredit them. The road to that point is actually one of cooperation and involvement between us and the states, and that's happening extensively now.
Yeah, I'd jump in with a quick comment around this. I mean, so how to achieve the engagement, at the level of principles would be described as subsidiarity and taking decisions at the lowest level possible, but no lower. And the words are important there because it's not the local level, it's the lowest level possible. And for some basin-wide issues, that may require coordination by a basin entity. So thinking of nesting of decision-making at scale is useful, and using that lower level nesting to get the engagement, get the buy-in needed to make some of these decisions. But the corollary to that is sometimes the appropriate level for decision doesn't have the capacity to do it. So having an infusion of resources, either upfront or sustained or both, is often important to build that capacity for engagement on the ground.
Good. Here, the front. Okay, you skipped the order, but anyway, good.
Okay. This is actually a question related to the last one. A lot of what we're talking about here in terms of having a meaningful engagement of civil society and sort of a rational conversation about water management implies that essentially facts matter and that people are fundamentally have, the good of the whole in mind. And what I've observed, unfortunately, in this country is sort of post-democracy, or it's not about the facts anymore. And to some degree, our government is owned by the Koch brothers and others who actually don't want people to have access to the facts. And so it's great to talk about engagement of civil society and the influence of the public in bringing rationality, but in certain circumstances in which I live, that's not what's happening. And I'm afraid that disease is probably going to spread to Australia as well.
I think we've got it. Yeah.
How do we avoid that?
Well, I don't think you can avoid that. I mean, the alternatives to that horrendous public space that we're talking about, and we've got the same sort of qualities to our public debates as the ones that you're describing. The alternatives are the guardians and Plato's guardians, and the response to Plato's guardians was, who guards the guardians? And I think there is no alternative except to get out there and try and win those debates and keep fighting. Institutional places where people can have some defence in the storm, they're really important. But fundamentally, we've got to contest the public space.
Kathy, while I share some of your cynicism, I would say this state over the last 10 years has had an amazing effort to talk about water, and there is a far greater appreciation amongst the various sectors right now within the state about the role that each plays, and that did not exist 10 years ago. I mean, the real problem I see in water is that it's a very complicated topical area, and the public gets kicked out of the room for it. I mean, we tell them they don't understand. That's the issue in water, is to get the level, the depth of discourse that you need.
Yes, I have a comment, and I thought the panel was outstanding. And one thing I reflect upon right now is the Great Lakes. And one of the I'm with the International Joint Commission, and one of our responsibilities is addressing the Great Lakes. And in the Great Lakes, flows to the Great Lakes take a long time. In fact, Lake Superior is over 300 years. And we went from historical lows a couple of years ago, almost historical lows, to almost historical highs in the last 2 years. And so we clearly recognize the impacts and the effects of climate change. And we have 3 regulatory boards that regulate through the rule curves, the operation, levels and flows throughout the Great Lakes. And one thing we have done is, over 6 years ago, we have put together some of the best minds around the Great Lakes in academia and in governments to address climate change. And this committee works very closely with our 3 regulatory boards on how to regulate the Great Lakes. And we have updated the rule curves recently. And one thing we have used, we have a decision to support system. That is a model system that does a great trade-off analysis, working with stakeholders and the public around the Great Lakes. There's 40 million people around the Great Lakes, and it's 20% of the fresh water in the world. So there's a lot of interest in the Great Lakes. But we have a great decision support system that we use to bring in public input continually in our process to evaluate how we change and operate the Great Lakes. Then we also have the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement outside of our regulatory authority on flows and regulations that looks at a holistic approach and how to manage water quality. And we're starting to experience real significant issues with water quality, for example, in Lake Erie. But thank you, because it's fun to reflect upon the Great Lakes and the issues in Australia and on the Colorado and the Columbia River.
You know, just a tiny little piece of that water would go a long ways in order to and that's the problem.
So as a current resident in the Great Lakes, I often start talks saying I'm not going to be stealing the water and taking it to the Colorado River Basin. That's a good point. But in terms of this learning from experience, it's worth noting that the River Murray Waters Agreement actually was reflecting on the International Boundary Water Agreement when developing the commission. You can see some of that in the legal analysis of that. So, I mean, we see examples of this learning happening centuries ago.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but there are 3 persons that have asked the floor. First the lady here, then in the middle, and finally the person at the end. And then we close.
So I'm a fan of modeling and simulation. And in the aerospace industry, we use a systems engineering approach where you model from end to end, and you have interdisciplinary teams. And in the space business, you use the worst case scenario. And so if you've ever studied complex systems, these river basins would be a complex system. And in the systems engineering approach, you have interdisciplinary teams. You would have a climatologist, you would have a hydrologist, a geologist, you would have economists, and you designate your risk. And so providing water quality to people who drink, that would be a high risk. And so you would look at your other risks and look at how you can do your trades to mitigate those trades so that you can provide water that's drinkable. And so I think people should take an end-to-end systems engineering approach like they do in other disciplines, and take that approach and use modeling and simulation and make it an interdisciplinary team with a number of stakeholders and present science, and then be able to have someone that can communicate that very high technical information to the stakeholders that are the users.
Yeah, Tony?
I would certainly agree with interdisciplinary teams. We try to do that as much as we can. But I would extend that beyond just traditional forms of science to involvement of Indigenous people in the way we actually manage our systems and wider societal values, and actually translating those into the policy debate. We certainly try to use models as much as we can, and I think they can be very useful for certain things, and also that they're not useful for other parts of that process. So it's certainly a complex system, and I would claim to have studied one. Whether to understand one, that's probably a higher test. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're having Kevin Wheeler talk in the next session, and he is one of, there are quite a few people in this room, but he's a person, I think, who can address a lot of the issues that you're raising there in a very informed way.
We've done some of that in both basins, right? In 2008, you all did your sustainable yields effort on climate change, and in 2012, we did the basin study. Part of the problem, I think, right now is trying to figure out these climate futures, and people get fixed on the median, and we're not seeing median outcomes. I think we still have a lot to learn on how to get better climate projections, and hopefully one area that will help us is the Paris Agreement, frankly. We are beginning to take off the worst outcomes because hopefully as that gets implemented, we will not do really stupid things with regard to carbon emissions. That's helpful, but then there's a lot of other steps that we need to get better on.
And I would just make one minor comment. I completely concur about the importance of simulation modeling and engaging an interdisciplinary team and stakeholders to use that effectively. The only caution I put out there is that these models often take institutions as fixed and don't account for the potential for change, and we have to change and we will change. So building some capacity to understand institutional change, governance aspects in this kind of coupled system modeling would be an important step.
Right in the middle.
Quick question for Brad. You talked about the correlation, well, you talked about temperature change going up so that we're having it during drought, but you didn't talk about a change in precipitation. Does that mean when temperature changes increase, is precipitation decreasing, going up, staying the same, or we don't know?
So that's the total bugaboo on these climate models, to tie into our last conversation. You know, wet air, the general statement in climate models is wet areas get wetter, dry areas get drier. But then you have these areas at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south that exist just poleward of deserts. And it's true in Australia, it's true here. We think those deserts march toward our wet areas, so towards the Colorado River headwaters. But the models show a variety of outcomes, from more precipitation to less precipitation. And which model you look at will color your idea of what the future looks like. Reclamation's recent study, so their most recent study issued in March of this year, shows the median output is no change in flow at 2100 in the Colorado River. You believe that? I don't. And the way you get to no change is you get significant increases in precipitation, which we expect to see in areas pretty far poleward, but I'm not so sure we're going to see it in this basin. And we haven't seen it in the first 16 years. We're 16% of the way in the 21st century right now. We have not seen it. I am not buying that argument.
So the very last comment at the bottom, at the back. Don? Sorry. He's ready for coffee. And then. There.
I feel compelled to respond to a point that was principle number 3 of Dr. DiStefano's summary of some of the federalism discussions. Follow the money, with a subsidiary point, not a subsidiarity point, that there may be questions on whether you can. Brad talked about the voracious competition between cities in Colorado, and one of the reasons I think we have failed in many ways to do more than talk compared to Australia's MDB is that we have a very high level of secrecy in how deals are actually made. Most options to buy are probably, and this is unknowable, never disclosed, and very probably are made with non-disclosure provisions in which typically a city acquires an option from a farmer and then uses those options or allegations of options as leverage on prices and willingness to sell by other farmers dependent on the same ditch. This is fairly well established in reporting, but it is not disclosed. The second part of this is that prices need not be disclosed. There is no central registry. There's no way to prove what a city says about what it paid is actually true unless the city has transparency clauses in its own ordinances, and it may have provisions in its ordinances which allow non-disclosure. We've been told by several cities in academic work that they simply will not discuss what they paid or even what they paid lawyers to work on making sure that they didn't have to disclose. The level of inability to follow the money has generated a very great level of distrust in rural ag, where we were probably going to make the most impact if we had the level of transparency that the MDB has achieved. I think we are making a huge mistake, and I'd like to ask for quick comments at the risk of us being delayed a moment on this whole ability to follow the money problem. Thank you.
Just make a quick point about the Murray-Darling trade. We often focus on the hydrology, water management side of it, but there's also information about the products being traded. There's requirements to actually make that information available. A well-informed market operates more efficiently, and also disclose the price of trades, and there's obligations to do that. So that's part of they are complementary parts of setting up a trading market, not just getting the hydrology or the water side of it right.
Two aspects. I think the information, getting information to the public sphere, I think that's absolutely crucial to that theme that I've been pushing about creating a well-informed public debate. On the other hand, I can see why, in a hostile environment, cities would want to be very discreet about that sort of information. So it's a classic example of a sensible short-term policy conflicting with how do you create in the longer term a high-quality public awareness and knowledge of the dynamics of what's happening in the society.
Briefly, because I know we need to get to coffee, I would just underscore the point about transparency and emphasize my closing remark. It's a no regrets option, but considering that in the U.S. context, there's a strong difference in a legal culture and the role that lawyers play in the process, and we have to be mindful of Daniel's point that information is bargaining power. So we're not talking, I mean, markets are based on transparent information, but we're not going to be able to use markets or many other kinds of tools to bring in flexibility unless we can make that information see daylight.
Okay, then thank you very much. Please join me. And I think we reconvene at 11:15.
That was fun.
Thank you.
Of the place within which you're trying to do them. Anyway, they're just some of my ideas, and we'll see what other people think over the next hour and a half. Okay, we're going to start off with Reed Benson from the University of New Mexico, Infrastructure and Climate Change. Now that's a very neat, mysterious package.
All right, thanks, Daniel, and thanks to the sponsors and organizers who have made this week's events possible. It's really been great, and I appreciate it. I'm a little less thankful for the title of my program, my title of my talk in the program. You may have thought that infrastructure and climate change sounded like a great excuse to extend your morning coffee break for about 20 minutes. But what do I mean by that? What I'm talking about is dam operations and the potential for changing dam operations going forward for existing facilities. And this is an issue that in the U.S. that I've been focusing on a lot in my scholarship for about the last 10 years or so, particularly the environmental aspects of dam operations, especially Bureau of Reclamation operations. And there's a lot of big, important, interesting issues in water policy. Why this one? Because I think it's got huge practical significance for rivers in the United States. So, why are reservoirs important? Well, start with the numbers. We've just got a lot of dams, about 75,000 dams nationally, almost all of which are in the lower 48. And these dams, built throughout the 20th century, have provided us, continue to provide us with important benefits. Water supply, flood control, hydropower, flat water recreation, among other things. And we as a society like those benefits. We have gotten used to them. We're not ready to give them up. But at the same time, we also recognize that these dams have had a lot of pretty serious impacts, including environmental impacts on downstream aquatic and riparian ecosystems, but not just environmental impacts. And I should note here that the tribes in particular, indigenous peoples, have lost a lot. Lands, fish, sacred sites, among other things. So the question is, can we operate these dams a little differently to reduce those impacts while retaining most or all of those benefits? And so here's one of the reasons I think this is so interesting. We have a system of laws and institutions for water management that is not built for flexibility. Never was built for flexibility, and it certainly hasn't operated in a way with much flexibility. Dams give us a chance to do some things differently than we have done before if we are willing to change how they operate. So when we talk about dams in the West, federal dams are of special importance. And so federal dam building agencies, familiar to most of you, the Bureau of Reclamation, now a 115-year-old agency almost, and these dams were built for water supply primarily. Originally it was just irrigation, and then expanded to provide municipal service. My home city of Albuquerque gets its drinking water from a reclamation project now. And then the Corps of Engineers has more dams than the Bureau nationally, although it's a little less important in most of the West. And the primary mission for the Corps is flood control, and has been that way since the 30s. So those are the two primary missions, but for both agencies, hydropower generation became a strong secondary focus, and in some places it almost looks like the primary focus for the operations of those two agencies. Worth noting that for most of the projects that the Bureau and the Corps built, Congress authorized them directly. So there is a statute or a set of statutes that lays out, among other things, the purpose or purposes for which these individual projects got built. And those statutes are important for saying what this project is all about. And a lot of the projects, particularly from the middle of the last century on, were authorized for multiple purposes, partly for politics, partly because it was easier to pay for them that way. So example, Hoover Dam, one of the early multi-purpose projects, and a dam we've heard a lot about in the last couple of days. So what do those project purposes and statutes have to do with operations of these dams? A lot. So the purposes for which Congress authorized it largely, though not entirely, dictate how that dam operates. Is flood control primary? Is water supply primary? How does hydropower factor in? Here's the thing. The long-range operating plans for those projects, for the most part, are decades old, just like the projects themselves. Most of these projects were built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s. not the annual operating decisions, but the long-range plans may be from the 40s, 50s, 60s. And not a lot may have changed since then. So as between the two agencies, the Corps has pretty detailed rules and guidance regarding keeping these plans regularly updated and speaking to, for example, when the public needs to be involved in revising the water control manual for a project. The Bureau has no parallel rules and guidance that speak to that subject, which would make you think maybe that the two agencies had really different practices in relation to revisiting the operations plans of these projects. But they don't. Neither of them does it. As a general policy matter, neither one makes a practice of regularly revisiting the operations plans for these projects. There's a lot of status quo. Those of you who think about dams think, oh, but there is one kind of project that has its operating regime periodically reviewed and revised. That kind is hydropower. Hydropower projects are required by law, and it's been this way for a long time, to have their operating licenses reviewed. So non-federal hydro projects need a license under the Federal Power Act, and these licenses don't last forever, 30 to 50 years, and then a project will need to be relicensed. And that relicensing by the federal agency that's now called FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, provides an opportunity and an obligation to consider things like environmental impacts, impacts on federal lands, on Indian country. Relicensing can mean a pretty big change in the operating requirements of the project, to the point that it might even make the project uneconomic to operate. If you're going to boost downstream flows so much that you can't even make money operating the project anymore, courts say that's okay. So so this is a requirement to consider these things. Interestingly, these are the private projects. These are the ones built with private capital. It's the public ones that we're not revisiting, which is a little ironic. So, so knowing all of that, and so, just laying out generally, why would you do it? Why would you revise operating plans? I'll make short work of this, in part because it makes common sense to most people that an old project should have its operating plan reviewed periodically, partly to incorporate the latest science, maybe to update the modeling, and Kevin will be talking more about the modeling. What do we know about the downstream effects of storage and releases that we didn't know maybe 50 years ago? Addressing climate change impacts, and this is a big one, and Brad's talk this morning certainly speaks to the importance of that. The project area may have changed. The land uses, the water uses, the economy, recreational and environmental values may also have changed. Engaging the public in reviewing the operations plan of a project gives an opportunity to consider all of these kinds of things for a basin that may look a lot different than it did when the project was first constructed. So after looking at all this in the US, I spent some time last fall up in Canada on a Fulbright looking in the part of Canada that's most like the Western United States in terms of water management challenges. Pretty similar law to our prior appropriation as it's been in recent years. Fully allocated rivers in the South Saskatchewan, irrigation heavy, growing cities, especially Calgary, unmet environmental needs, lots of plumbing. So I was looking at how do they make decisions about operating that plumbing? Plumbing like Waterton Reservoir. So this is on the Waterton River, which flows north from Montana into Alberta. And a lot of the big dams in Alberta are are owned by the province and operated by this provincial agency. And so the big water supply reservoirs are provincial in many of them. And importantly, the project purposes of these things are not statutory. They are license conditions. They're conditions just of the water rights. Water right, so AEP, this provincial agency, not only owns and operates the projects, but holds the licenses for them and issues the licenses for them. That's a lot of authority in a single agency. So, and the license conditions, the conditions of the water rights for these projects give the agency a lot more flexibility than you would see with some of the American projects. So, so what do? Same thing. They don't make a practice of doing this either. That is, of really revisiting and revising fundamentally the operations plans, which tells you that it's not just a legal thing, right? There is something else going on here, and I want to note, giving credit to AEP, that they have shown some important green flexibility in how they operate. So why the inertia? Whether in the U.S. or Western Canada, start by the fact that existing operations have a set of users and beneficiaries, and their interests count. They weigh heavily politically, but also just the agencies themselves that have been operating these dams, they see this as their clientele. And so the agencies themselves are sensitive to potential impacts of changes on those people. Closer to home for the agency as bureaucracy, there's the time, there's the money, there's the political controversy associated with engaging the public on really thinking about redoing dam operations plans. You're reluctant to take on any of that if you're an agency, especially with a limited budget. You might not want to make waves. Finally, in the US, and this is ironic for the federal water projects, NEPA is an issue. Our National Environmental Policy Act, which provides for environmental reviews of federal actions, is triggered by a lot of kinds of federal actions, but the courts have interpreted NEPA, I think wrongly, to say that the federal agencies that operate dams don't need to do environmental reviews so long as they're operating the project in the way they always have. Strong disincentive for the agencies to really put change on the table. So long as they maintain the status quo, they're good. They don't need to do NEPA. Ironic. So what has overcome this? Again, somewhat ironically, it's another environmental law, most commonly Endangered Species Act. For the US, the need to comply with the ESA has forced more environmental or more operational reviews than anything else. But there are some other examples too, where you've got an influential local player that wants something different out of the dam than they've been getting. Then that too can prompt an agency to move when it wasn't before. Example of this, Lake Lanier, the Corps' Lake Lanier in Georgia, which Atlanta has wanted more of for water supply for a long time. Once the courts clarified that the Corps could give Atlanta more water as an authorized project purpose, the Corps set about to revise the water control manual for this thing and give Atlanta more water. So just now that I'm out of time, I need to say just a bit about climate change. That is, Brad mentioned this law too, the Secure Water Act. He talked about the basin studies and the reports. That's the part of this law that the Corps, that the Bureau has really emphasized in implementation. The part they haven't emphasized is adaptation strategies. The law directs them not just to consider what climate change might do to water supply, but think about what we might do about it, and that can include changes in dam operations. They've been reluctant to put those things on the table for some of the reasons we talked about. The agency does have an agency-wide climate adaptation strategy, which really features water management flexibility and talks about potential changes in dam operations. We'll see how much of it happens. As far as the Corps goes, just very quickly, that Congress has been pushing the Corps to be more flexible in relation to drought and water supply, and we'll see how far that gets. Final thing, operations matter for this reason. Dams have already altered the rivers of the United States greatly. There would be great reason to do dam operations revisions even without climate change. But what climate change will do makes it all the more urgent to do it and do it now. Thank you.
Okay. There's Maura from the University of Seville.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, everybody. Just quickly, I want to thank Dustin, Garrick, and Lucia De Stefano for bringing us together this week, because it has been an outstanding opportunity to meet other colleagues, great scholars, practitioners, and just learn so much. And I look forward to continuing working in this network that you're creating, that I'm very fortunate, hopefully, to be a part of. So I'm going to talk again about water markets that Dustin talked about a little bit earlier. And the reason, and in the specific case of Spain, that I think is slightly different than in the US, the reason why I got interested in this topic is because Spain is the only member of the European Union, a member country within the European Union, where water markets are operational, have been operational for a while. And whereas the European Union has had a very publicly oriented legislative stance towards environmental management, there has been a shift in recent years, and a growingly strong shift in recent years, to rely more or explore the possibility of relying on economic instruments to achieve environmental goals. And I thought that if this is the trend that is going to be, we need to have some real analysis and evaluation of how the instruments that are in place are working to achieve those goals. So I've started for the last few years analyzing, starting to study with some colleagues, Lucia among them, the experience in Spain with water markets. There's a little bit of context, just because I don't think you're as familiar with the Spanish context as you are with the Colombia or even with Australia, where a lot of people have been studying and looking at water markets for a long time. Just like in all other federal, quasi-federal countries, there are many levels of responsibility. It's a nested system, but in the European case, there is another level that doesn't exist here, above the federal level or the central government, which is the European Union, that has large legislative powers. And when the European Union issues legislation in the form, well, the treaties are kind of the basic constitution, but in the form of regulations or directives or case law, those directives are of obligatory compliance within member states. So when the European Union issues a directive on environmental issues, for instance, member states have to transpose that legislation into our internal legislation, and we have to comply with it. And the European Commission does the role, a similar role to the federal government here or in other federal states, of making sure and reviewing the way we are actually complying with European Union legislation. So there is another layer of complexity, compliance, and integration that is necessary. And integration and harmonization that is particularly difficult, because we're talking about 28 countries with vastly different political, cultural, territorial, socioeconomic traditions. So getting all those on the same page is really quite challenging. The challenge of coordination also at the national level, in the case of Spain, and I mentioned that in the workshop, is interesting because Spain has a strong tradition of river basin-based management. We have the first river basin organization was created in 1926. And so for over 100 years, we have managed our rivers along river basin boundaries and with river basin management plans of different kind and with different goals. What happened is that those were centrally controlled to a large extent. And in the 1970s, with the advent of democracy, there was a new political administrative system emerged that is quasi-federal. And so there has been a lot of efforts at adjustment at the role that now the increasingly powerful regional governments have on a wide range of matters, and how the division of powers between the central government and the regional governments is distributed. In the issue of water, as Lucia mentioned with many other places, is a particularly contentious area of negotiation and conflict. So a little bit about Spain, similar in size to California, and there's a wide variability both in distribution of rainfall with the humid north, in arid southeast. There is interannual variability, there is intraannual variability. We have recurrent droughts, usually they come every 10 years more or less. And because of the kind of Mediterranean climate that we have, agriculture is very, and has been for hundreds of years, reliant on irrigation. So about 80% of consumptive water uses is used for irrigation, which makes irrigators a very powerful player in the distribution and the allocation of water. Hydroelectric is not a consumptive use, but about 40% of all stored water in Spain is used for hydroelectricity production. Hydroelectric companies are the other really big player in water management and water policy making. Spain is a hydraulically mature society. There's just not a lot more of places where we can build more infrastructure. The graph on the right shows the progression of dam building along the 20th century. We have now about 1,200 large dams built in Spain. There are a lot of interbasin water transfers, the main one being the big red arrow that transfers water from the upper Tajo basin in central Spain towards the southeast, which is where there is a structural deficit, as was very well defined, the socially created structural deficit, because demands right now largely exceed available supplies, and there's a very strong and vibrant economy based on irrigation of horticultural production, and tourism. A lot of the 60 million tourists that come to Spain every summer come along the water-scarce southeast, not very unlike the southwest in the US. The result of this intense era of dam and infrastructure construction has been very compromised aquatic ecosystems. This is the evaluation of the status of aquatic ecosystem surface water in Spain that has come out of the latest round of river basin management plans, that essentially tells us on the left is the biological, ecological integrity, and so everything that is not green or blue is not in good status, and measures have to be put in place to improve, recover the health of those systems. And on the right is chemical water quality, and so when you have it in blue, it's okay. When you have it in red, is that there are serious quality problems. And on the left is the combinations of both indicators. In general, about 50%, more or less, of our surface waters need some kind of intervention. This is pretty much the same across Europe. It's not specific to Spain. These are very cultural systems, very human-altered systems. We don't have the beautiful untouched nature that you still are lucky to have in this continent. The main pressures: agricultural diffuse pollution, insufficient urban and industrial wastewater treatment, hydromorphological alterations, that is a huge one, and our allocation of water rights. These four pressures affect 100% of our rivers and streams. Groundwater, very similar story. Here the problem is mostly non-point source pollution from agriculture, and chemical water quality is the main problem. Okay, how do we allocate water in Spain? We have a system of allocation that was started in the late 19th century, an 1879 water law that hasn't changed too much in the last 120 years. Even though we have a new law in 1985, the allocation system is more or less the same. We have a treaty with Portugal to allocate water. Within the country, we have the National Hydrologic Plan. Within the river basins, we have river basin management plans that Theo described yesterday. But what is relevant is the water rights at the level of the user. So how are those water rights allocated? Spain has what is called all waters are part of the hydraulic, well, the majority. I'm not going to go into it. Groundwater, parts of the groundwater are different, but a majority of the water is part of what is called the hydraulic public domain, so is public trust. But water permits are given for a maximum of 75 years. The long licensing periods, what have happened in practice is that users have a sense of private property, like it's their right, and it's hard to introduce any kind of alteration in existing rights. So, because many of these rights are old and were given before environmental concerns were the norm, it is hard for instance, increasingly challenging to institute environmental flows because obviously users resist any kind of limitations to their water use permits, even though legally it would be possible. So what happens at the end is that the permit review process, for any reason, environmental, socioeconomic, are processes that are politically very challenging, very expensive potentially, and therefore they seldom ever happen. What have happened, and that's something that among the general conclusions I didn't see, but I thought was a very interesting conclusion of our workshop, is that the law is the law, that's the formal law, and so when you have to resolve problems of scarcity, you look for alternatives that are not illegal, but maybe a little bit outside of the law. You look for alternatives to bypass the legal framework. And so for many years, there have existed different experiences of what we call informal water markets, because they're not necessarily legal. They could be, but not necessarily, but they fall outside the letter of the law. And they've served to resolve local problems of scarcity or drought in specific areas. Usually it's exchanges between urban areas and surrounding agricultural irrigation systems, or between different irrigators. Okay, so in this context, this is the evolution of the mean precipitation in Spain. And in the 1990s, there was a severe drought, 92, 94, you can see circled in blue, where there were major socioeconomic losses in agriculture, in hydroelectricity production, and severe cuts in a lot of very major cities. Cities of 1 million inhabitants had water cuts for 10 hours a day. And some of them were at the verge of collapse at the end of the summer of 93, I think it was. So obviously we weren't managing droughts correctly. There was a real problem and there was a need to change. And a lot of these cuts were happening in cities that were surrounded by irrigation districts that were continuing to irrigate when the cuts were taking place. So there was a widespread agreement that maybe introducing flexibility in this very rigid water allocation system would allow us to meet situations of drought and give more flexibility, avoid cuts in urban areas, provide an alternative to large interbasin water transfers that were still being proposed but were very politically conflictive, and that would allow us maybe in a less painful way to start shifting the paradigm for this from the era of big dam building to a new, more sustainable water management institutional framework. So two water market figures were introduced in the 1999 Water Act reform, water permit trading and public water banks. I've put in red, I'm not going to go into the characteristics too much, but they were very highly regulated. But in the permit trading, what was interesting is that in order to protect the public trust, in order to make them politically acceptable to those that would react negatively to the introduction of this market, a lot of the debate was whether introducing market was actually making water a commodity instead of a public trust, where there's a strong sense of water as a public trust, as I said. So there were all these kind of protections in order to guarantee the protection of the public interest and minimize environmental harm or eliminate potential environmental harm that could result from these trades. So for instance, interbasin water permit trading was forbidden. You could only sell the amount of water that you actually proved you had used, not the volume of your permit, but what you had used for the past 3 years. And you could only trade between permit holders. It meant they didn't want to open the pool, expand the pool of water users. It had to be between those that already had permits, right? So it was a new allocation. It was a tool for reallocation. The limitations in red are limitations that have been removed over the past 15 years since the reform was passed. And the removal and the markets have been progressively liberalized. A lot of these protections have been eliminated. And the reason why, and this is, we'll go to the final conclusion or things for thought, it wasn't because we were still trying to do what the markets were supposed to do, which is flexibilize the system. There were actually these reforms, and the markets have been utilized to achieve other goals that are very different from what supposedly they were supposed to achieve. There was this large interbasin water transfer that I pointed in the map. Is similar to a much, much smaller scale to the Colorado River. It was designed at a time using the data from a particularly humid period. And so it was designed to transfer from the headwaters of a major system that supplies Madrid and Lisbon in Portugal and a lot of other major cities to supply a certain amount of water. Well, in reality, the amount of water that is available in the headwater is 50% less than what it originally thought. So in many years, in blue is the river flow. There's been this effect of the 80s in many rivers in Spain, and there's a discussion whether it's climate change, land use change, a variety of issues. So there's been major reductions in river flows in many rivers already in Spain. And in brown is what is transferred. Well, what happened is that sometimes you were transferring 100% of the headwaters from that river to the other basins. So of course, imagine between regions that have more power, this has become the political issue in Spain, the conflictive issues and what dominates water management conflicts. So in the little circle is the next drought that hit in 2005, 2008. Water transfers, the operational rules for the transfer protect the donor basin. So when reserves fall below a certain level, you can't transfer anymore. The water users, the recipient region, which are a very powerful irrigator association, similar to some of the irrigator associations in California, they have a lot of political clout, pressured the government to give them a solution. Well, the solution was like, we're not getting into a political debate of whether we're going to transfer more water or not with as many problems as we have. We're going to bring the markets, which are supposedly apolitical, efficient, wonderful solutions, and what we're going to do is allow you to do interbasin water trading. And that is what they did, especially at first, only with annual emergency drought decrees. They allowed irrigators in the donor basin, the Tajo Basin, to sell to the recipient basin. When in the Tajo Basin there were severe environmental damages and restrictions to users per se, but because the politicians didn't have anything to do with it, the trades happened. And so what happened is whereas globally trade has been the market is very thin, trades, even during that drought globally in the country, represent less than 1% of total volumes used. In the recipient regions of the water transfer, they represented up to 30% of total volumes transferred. So I know it's a very context-specific lesson. We can't draw lessons, but I think some of the reflections for the case, context-specific lessons learned in Spain, is that the interaction of markets changes, it implies changes in the relative value that we assign to the market versus political deliberation. Our Australian colleagues say there is a fork in the road where you decide where you want to go. Do you want to go this way and keep making allocation decisions through political deliberation, or do you want to go this other way and use economic instruments? In Spain, legally prescribed trading mechanisms are very infrequent, and they are being used not to deal with situations of scarcity and resolve situations of scarcity, but to override the limitations existing in interbasin infrastructures, transfer infrastructures, and so to avoid the political outfall of conflictive transfer decisions. The restrictions that were eliminated during the drought have been permanently eliminated in the latest reform in 2013, so that as of 2013, users can trade freely between river basins. So if anybody in any context is thinking, there was a question earlier, to introduce, to use markets, and I think each society has to deliberate openly about what the best solutions are for each specific context, obviously. I think some things that have to be taken into account. Markets first have to be part of a broader basin management system, well planned, well understood, and it has to be part of the larger institutional context. They have to be clearly defined, solid and stable institutions for them to operate adequately. The goals have to be clear. They have to be said, this is why we're introducing them, so their performance can be evaluated according to those goals, and not as an excuse to achieve other goals that are not explicit. There has to be absolute transparency with regard to the market characteristics, and this, I think, hardly ever happens. I'm somewhat convinced that maybe in Australia it happens more, but I'll have to ask more in the next few months to know is the case. You know, who buys, who sells, what is the price? I mean, something as key, an economic instrument, and most people don't know the price of buyers and sellers because these are private transactions. The volumes traded, what are the areas affected, et cetera. No? There have to be clearly delineated boundaries for that market. And one other thing, it has to be constant evaluation of the socioeconomic, the environmental, and the territorial impacts of the transactions, but you can't evaluate them in an aggregate fashion because the impacts are geographically distributed. And so you can't just say on a basin level there has been a gain in economic efficiency. Who has won? Who has lost? Where are the regions affected? And then as a society decide if those are trade-offs that we are willing to accept. Thank you.
Comparisons, what lessons learnt. There's an awful lot of lessons about things not to do. There's lots of them. Yeah, I think that was, thank you. Good.
I might be picking up on that.
Right, so we're now going to Canada. Michelle Lee.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I do want to echo what everybody else has already shared, but thanks very much to the organizers for bringing us together. It's now been almost a full week, and it's just been a really wonderful experience to have a chance to learn so much about these different watersheds around the world. And also, I just felt very welcome in Colorado, so thank you very much for that. I also want to, before I begin, I want to acknowledge with respect the customs, culture, and history of the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples upon whose traditional territories and watersheds we're meeting today. And I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin, some of whom are here with us, because I'm actually, as the Canadian in the room, not going to speak about Canada, but I'm going to speak about some research I conducted back in 2010 in the Murray-Darling Basin. And I, with that, also want to acknowledge the fact that as the Canadian in the room talking about the Murray-Darling, I recognize there are a lot of other people in this room who could speak much more in depth about that. So I do this quite humbly and with respect to the work that you've been doing, particularly since 2010. And Tony reminded me that a lot of the work that I would have been doing back in 2010 has obviously it's evolved, and you've been hearing about that over the course of the couple of days. But what I want to focus on actually is the role of a transnational networks and relationships with a transboundary but not international basin during an innovation process, which arguably they very much have been going through for many years now, but also acknowledging, based on what we heard yesterday with Indigenous water justice issues, obviously governance innovation is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to do in all of our watersheds. So hopefully I won't have to spend any time convincing you that the status quo and the way that we govern water is not okay anymore, and that we need to actually transform water governance. So I'm hoping I already have you on side for at least that part. And so what I would argue then is that we need governance innovations in order to accomplish that. And I don't use that word lightly as a buzzword or just as a descriptive. I actually use it as an analytical lens, and specifically define it as any new program, policy, or process, and I would actually even add platform, that alters the basic routines and practices, resource and authority flows, or norms, beliefs, and values of any governance system. And that work that definition is based on some work coming out of the Waterloo Institute on Social Innovation, and is also based quite a bit on Giddens' social structuration theory. So I'm interested in this idea of governance innovation, but the question is how do we do it? And we've been hearing a lot, and we will continue to hear more about these various innovations that are happening in different watersheds. But a lot of the time when we talk about them, and I do this as well in my work, is we tend to talk about it at an aggregate level, at least at the organizational level. And I want to bring it down to remembering that there's also individuals. And a lot of the time when we hear, the theory of how water markets could be or should be, and then what it looks like in terms of the messiness in practice, a lot of that comes down to the individuals and the decisions and strategies that we use and make. So in terms of innovation, a lot of all research, I would say, seems to have different models for how they talk about it, but everybody does seem to agree that governance innovation processes are multi-phased. So I tend to use one that has 4 distinct phases in it. So it starts with a generation phase, actually generating the program or policy or process or organizational structure, and then actually a selection process. You can always, in any innovation process, and I think we've been hearing that repeatedly, there's multiple pathways to get at making some of these either reforms or transformations happen. So there need to be mechanisms to actually evaluate which ones are we going to invest our resources, social, intellectual, and financial capital into. And in the Murray-Darling Basin, you've heard about a few of the ones that they've selected that are part of this, a suite of part of how they've been transforming governance there. So part of that, within the literature, there's a lot of thinking around the fact that if we want these governance innovation processes, how do we organize ourselves? And there's a lot of increasing interest, I would say, around the role that networks can play in this. And but primarily, the literature that looks at networks and innovation, and there is quite a long history of that in scholarship, has actually come out of business and organizational studies. And predominantly what they're interested in is diffusing a product and quite often, basically, how do you get consumers to buy your technology? How do you scale it out? There are lots of useful insights in that literature for thinking about governance innovation, but scaling out at making sure consumers buy technology and diffusing that widely is also quite different than governance innovation. So it is quite limited. There is a smaller subfield within governance studies that's looking at what they would term as networked governance. But again, primarily they're talking about things that relate to diffusion processes as well. So in that case, they're often talking about the diffusions of regulations, standards, harmonization of standards, the diffusion of certain norms. In water, we often talk about the networks that have been involved in advocating and pushing the concept of integrated water resources management globally, and the idea of creating watershed-based organizations itself, that norm, and a normative approach towards watershed governance. So there's a lot of work going on in this network governance field, but again, it's just primarily focused on this idea of diffusion and adoption. And so I want to talk a little bit about what are the potential roles that networks can play in all of the phases of innovation. And I specifically want to look at the cross-scale dynamic of, again, this transnational network in watersheds that may be transboundary, but not necessarily international. So again, I've been blessed to have people already speaking quite extensively about the Murray-Darling Basin, so I don't need to explain, I'll use my time to explain the context. Hopefully I don't need to convince you that you can understand how the changes that they've been undertaking since 2007 and even before that do meet my governance innovation definition. So hopefully I've convinced, I don't have to spend time convincing you of that, but I do want to say I spent time in 2010 essentially working, I was lucky enough to have kind of access to staff working within the Murray-Darling Basin Authority who were responsible for drafting the basin plan and some of these innovative strategies that you've been hearing about over the last few days. And so this is what I'm going to be presenting is based on about 54 semi-structured interviews with staff within the Basin Authority at that time. And one focus group that we hosted within the Basin Authority. And as well, I was fortunate enough at this point in time before they released the plan, they were still holding a lot of community information sessions around the basin. So I was able to attend as a participant observer in those different parts of the basin and understand the different kind of regional perspectives on what was about to be proposed and what they understood was coming down the pipe. I will say I also at that time was conducting numerous surveys to actually analyze the social network itself using social network analysis. I will not get into all of that. That's a whole other presentation, but suffice to say there was one, and I did map it out to understand sort of the structure of those relationships. So I'm going to compress this quite a bit for the sake of time and brevity, but suffice to say those first three phases that I was talking about in the governance innovation process, generation, selection, and adoption, for the most part, what I was finding was that Murray-Darling Basin Authority at that time, and I would recognize it has shifted since then, was not engaging in any sort of linkages with a transnational network. They were primarily, there was some work being done. They had mapped out their own local networks as part of their required consultation processes and were seeking some input and insights at that point at that time. But I would say there was a lot of criticism in leading up to the release of the draft basin plan that was insufficient at that point. And so we often talk about the fact that we have this shift moving from government to governance in water work. And I would actually argue at that point it looked, to me at least, more like a shift from governance to government at that particular point in time. And again, with selection processes, they were going through all of those also internally within the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, with staff themselves sorting it out, as opposed to doing that through a broader networked process, and certainly not seeking input from any sort of transnational linkages. And that included into this adoption phase. So again, most of the research that exists says that's when transnational networks could potentially play a role because of things like best practices and models that you might be seeking. And it's not that they weren't looking out there, but it wasn't necessarily a big part of the strategy for developing this. Part of it was because of the tight time frame they were under and the commitments that they had made politically to take action at that point in time. And you've heard that since then that has, those deadlines got pushed out and they were able to go out and do a lot more of that work. But I think there was also a very clear perspective by the participants in this study who perceived the fact that, and I would say that I have experienced this in other watersheds, that people often feel like this is their context is so unique, what could we possibly get from other watersheds? They're not going to understand what we're going through here. And so I think there was also some resistance to engaging in that way. So when I did finally find some evidence of transnational network linkages, it was in this final implementation phase. I won't go into all of the examples of how the transnational network was engaged in reshaping, I would argue, watershed governance that was happening at that time, but I'll just give you the one quick example of reframing and refining the regulatory regime. You've heard about the strategies in the basin plan and the science behind the sustainable diversion limits, the environmental buybacks that were part of that basin plan. And what happened at the time before they had released it publicly was they engaged 4 network nodes to come in and essentially do an international peer review of the science and the models that were informing that plan and those sustainable diversion limits. Those later became publicly available, the reviews, but at that time they weren't. And there was a lot of discussion there about how to actually even frame the basin plan and whether I think there was a lot of sentiment at that time that somehow the states had messed up and that's why the federal government had to step in. And so there was some cautionary notes around actually framing that discourse. But what you see then is there's sort of this soft governance role that this transnational network ended up playing in terms of providing a place to debate some of these kinds of issues around framing, but also actually refining what becomes a regulatory regime in terms of reviewing the science that inform those sustainable diversion limits. And that's interesting in a non-transboundary basin. But I just want to explain one other thing that happened at that time, and I think it's hopefully insightful for those of you that may be, again, pushing ideas around reform and transformation or being responsible for undertaking these kinds of things. It was a highly, not only contested process within the basin and with different stakeholders, and you've heard about the burning of the draft basin plan when it was released, but it was actually also really challenging for people within Murray-Darling Basin Authority who were responsible for doing this on behalf of the public, on behalf of the ministers, and on behalf of the executive who had made some of these decisions. And so you can see there's a whole range of reasons that this was a challenge for them. Some related just to mission and identity. Having gone from a multi-state-based partnership, collaborative, consensus-based organization to a more top-down federal government authority was just uncomfortable for people. And if you've ever gone through a reorg in your own organization, you know how challenging that is. You see people doubting sort of whether they were following sort of best available knowledge around participatory decision-making processes at that time and being skeptical that the federal government as an authority could do that. And again, wanting to go out and network and talk to people and that not actually being sort of encouraged at that time. And again, this comment about the let's have it out before the election and feeling like some of the politics were interfering with actually getting the plan right. So one of the things for a long time I felt like they were just sort of, I think I actually even ignored it in the data at first, which is why I've come back to it later in terms of understanding what they were actually going through within the organization at that time. And one of the things was that a lot of the people involved were technical experts. They were biologists, legal experts, hydrologists, who suddenly were confronted with the public who were complaining and putting a lot of pressure on, and there was contestation over what was being proposed. And there was uncertainty and just discomfort, to be honest, with whether or not they felt like, do I know the best possible approach? And of course, we're talking about complex solutions for complex problems. There is no perfect model or perfect science. And so they felt they needed almost reassurance. And it was at that point that they started reaching out to these transnational networks to provide some of that and navigate some of that contestation and reassure them of this subject mastery. There was also recognition by the participants of the ethical implications. One participant saying, I'm just a modeler and I'm playing with people's lives and livelihoods. This recognition of, and another participant stating, this is where the science stops and the policy begins. And again, kind of questioning, do I really know what's best? And how challenging that is to do that on behalf of others, and particularly when you're going out and in the public and being criticized for that and your technical expertise being challenged. So a lot of where I came to, and there's some research in the public policy reform who have been looking at this in other issue areas beyond water, including health, is that one of the roles that transnational networks can play is actually in mitigating what we describe as a sense of alienation. So actually a social disconnect that people experience with being responsible for implementing a policy that they're not quite sure they even agree with yet. And I want to be very clear that the people within the Murray-Darling Basin Authority were the first people to say they needed to undertake governance innovation. But it was, again, this questioning of, but is this the right way? Is this the pathway that we should be on? Are we still best? Because they had long been recognized for being one of these leading organizations. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the transnational network did provide critical support for that implementation phase of transformative innovation, but did not seem to be, I didn't have evidence that they had been engaged in earlier phases of the whole process. And I would actually argue that when I was interviewing some of the executive, because network relationships are personal and based on individuals, they were sometimes just because I went to college with somebody and now they're in this other country or this other organization. But sometimes they were also based on their own policy area. The people who operated the dams were networked organizations on the International Commission on Large Dams, for instance. The people running the stakeholder engagement processes were engaged with transnational actors who undertake public participation processes. But that meant that at the executive level, nobody really had a sense of all the range of resources that they actually had access to through this network. There was not necessarily then, as a result, a strategic leveraging and management of this transnational network that they actually were connected to through their staff. So I think we need to have a lot more research on understanding how we can possibly use the transnational networks in these governance innovation processes in terms of mitigating this sense of alienation that comes with trying to navigate these complex processes that are often highly contested and being responsible for the people who are responsible for taking that on behalf of others. And I suspect some of you have that role yourselves in your own watersheds and probably can relate to the contestation that brings and how deeply conflicting that can be for yourself in terms of navigating that process. And I will end there.
Right, well, I think that was an excellent introduction to modelling. And where does that fit into this whole process of trying to get change and improvement and better results? Kevin.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to be here. Thanks to Dustin and Lucia and Daniel for the opportunity to speak today. It's kind of a coming home for me. I grew up here in Colorado, and about 4 years ago went to Oxford so I could focus on the Nile. But a lot of my heart's back in Colorado, working on these issues and comparing the two back and forth, or bringing some of the experiences from the Colorado to the Nile. So I'll be talking about that today. So a quick little outline to some water resource systems analysis, and then get into these case studies. I'm just going to skip over Colorado pretty fast to get to the Nile. That seems a little more interesting to people. But in general, these water resource systems, they're very important. They don't solve every problem, and I think that's one of the key things that we always try to impress. We say models, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Some of our famous quotes. So typically, some amount of water we know goes into a reservoir, and they're trying to meet some various uses of the reservoir, like agriculture, municipal, environmental, recreational uses. Flood control and energy generation is often some of the highest priorities, as was mentioned. So how do we operate these reservoirs, these multi-objective reservoirs, considering the water quantity, the water quality, and make recommendations for reservoir operations or releases? So either we're setting releases from a reservoir in some sort of pattern, like shown above there, or setting elevation targets for reservoirs, specifying diversions, that type of thing. So these are the water resource models. And then put that into a network context where we have several different reservoirs trying to satisfy several different water users with multiple objectives. Gets very, very complicated. And then you throw in a border between them and then figure out, okay, how are you going to operate these reservoirs? And it's very difficult to do this without some type of systems thinking, of understanding how the numbers propagate through the system. Okay, the Colorado River. I don't have to talk about this much, but we know the law of the river. So the last four of those, starting with the interim surplus guidelines in 2000, this is when I first started getting involved in Colorado River issues. These ones relied very heavily on water resource systems analysis. So the surplus guidelines, the lower basin shortage guidelines, Minute 319, and more recently the Colorado supply and demand study. So in 1973, the Bureau of Reclamation developed the CRSS, Colorado River Simulation System. It was a Fortran model, a black box model, a bunch of lines of code. I couldn't understand it. Very difficult for anybody to really understand or edit. And it becomes a challenge and extremely useful for figuring out some of the operations, but became very difficult for anybody to use. So in the 1990s to 2000s, there was really a clear need that this needed to be broken down. A lot of these people that had designed these models were retiring, and there was a need to bring in more stakeholders. And the policies obviously needed to evolve. So this new software would be developed. One of the primary ones, probably one of the best in the world, was developed here at University of Colorado at CADSWES, called Riverware. And it was a combination between the Bureau of Reclamation, Tennessee Valley Authority, and later on, more recently, the Army Corps of Engineers contributed. But transparency of the modeling was very important in the design of it. 2007, the shortage criteria, I won't talk much about that, but obviously came out with fairly complex operations of these different shortage levels, different trigger levels, this type of thing, to try to manage some of the water a little bit better as the reality evolved. And then the Mexico-USA treaty, or the modified in 319, the shortage sharing agreement, surplus sharing, ICMA, that's Mexico being able to bank water within the United States. These type of things, they needed some pretty complex analyses to understand, and then the delta pulse flow. Okay, so expanding fields of expertise. Obviously, when you start, Bureau of Reclamation comes in, they're the engineers. Of course, everyone else comes in with their engineers, comes in with their lawyers. A large body of people, and everyone has to have their own technical people. So Bureau of Reclamation really starts building up the computer modeling side of it. And of course, that responds with a lot of the states bringing in their own computer modeling expertise as well. And that allows us to create some networks of information, of systems, of approaches, people being able to talk to each other, not just via formal meetings, but also being able to share data back and forth and be able to look at these systems as the way that each entity is thinking about how they're being operated, or how they could operate. And then, of course, the NGOs coming in, and the tribes with the strong legal background. And then the environmental groups investing in some of this systems thinking and hiring modelers, that type of thing. I believe it became a very strong force within them being able to negotiate through some of these treaties. Mexico being involved in this as well. They came up. The Bureau of Reclamation actually supported Mexico's training in some of the CRSS modeling. And they were able to contribute to the conversations as well. And I'm doing a lot of studying now of sort of how effective that was from sort of a retrospective of Minute 319. And of course the tribes, and I really think that they could and they should increase their technical capacity as well to be able to engage in these conversations. So lessons learned, a common analytical platform is very critical to make progress and to be able to really understand sort of what's going on outside of your own small point of view. The access to stakeholders, allowing stakeholders to access these models, allowing the NGOs, the nonprofits, the civil society, be able to tear them apart, critique them, figure out what's wrong, put them back together. Don't be afraid of the critique. Early stakeholder engagement, I think, is a very critical thing, and actively encouraging stakeholders to get these models and to look at them, to look at the data, look at the inputs, look at the outputs, question them. They'll get better over time. And enhancing the technical capacity of these groups. Again, a system-wide understanding to find solutions. Okay, so I'm really interested in questions like this. Who develops these models? Who understands the models? Who really understands them? Who can really use the models? Who will trust the models? If we're going to try to make these as central platforms, then people need to actually have some trust in them, and what can we do to increase that? And then who maintains the model? It's like trying to maintain your old car in the garage. It'll break down if you're not investing into it. Okay, I'm going to jump forward into the Nile. So the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and I'll do a little bit of background on it and just sort of the study that I've been working on. Okay, so quick comparison. The Colorado River versus the Nile. Colorado River with about 40 million people. The Nile with about 238 million people. The Colorado with 7 states, plus the 2 states in Mexico, across 2 different countries. Nile, 11 different countries. You can see all the numbers there. Agriculture is the largest usage. So under the management agreements, we obviously in the Colorado have our compact in 1922, and the list goes on and on. In the Nile, a lot of it's been controlled by the, or a lot of the history is wrapped in the colonial time, in the colonial era. So 1902, a very contested treaty between Ethiopia and the United Kingdom. where they said they would not arrest the waters of the Nile without permission of Egypt, essentially. But the Ethiopians said, well, that was actually, the word arrest means to completely stop, so we can change things. But they actually don't even so they don't recognize that treaty as being valid. 1929 treaty between the British and all the other controlled areas, controlled regions of the British and Egypt. So questions on whether that is valid still. Most of the countries do not. 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan. They said we will get all the water. We will take all the water. Nobody else signed up to that. But they still follow that. So there's no basin-wide agreements on the Nile. Okay, here's our geography lesson. Where does the Nile start? Lake Victoria. The other one, Lake Tana, up in Ethiopia. So from Lake Victoria flows the Victoria or Albert Nile, and that goes into a large area called the Sud Swamp or the Sud Wetlands. About 50% of the water gets evapotranspirated from the wetlands. From the Sud flows the White Nile, and that goes into the capital city of Khartoum. And then from Lake Tana flows in a circle around the Blue Nile, and this is the vast majority of the water comes from the highlands of Ethiopia. And they form a confluence right in the middle of the city of Khartoum. And then downstream from that flows the main Nile, which passes through the large reservoir, the High Aswan Dam, Lake Nasser. And across this entire area, okay, so here's the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. And here's where the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is being constructed. So it's just upstream of the border going from Ethiopia into Sudan. Across the entire area, poverty is very pervasive. That's I think we all know that. Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries in the entire region. Egypt being one of the stronger countries. A lot as a result of the High Aswan Dam being constructed as well. Okay, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or called the GERD oftentimes. Google it, you'll find lots of information on it. It has been proposed for a long time, and starting in 2011, it is reality. Every Ethiopian pays about a month of their salary to build this dam. There's incredible amount of national pride in this dam. It's seen as the savior of poverty for Ethiopians within the country. It's amazing. At the same time, Egypt has been terrified for thousands of years that Ethiopia could block the waters of the Nile. There's an incredible history between the two, dating back to a lot of the fears and the relationship with the Coptic Church and the Muslim government was maintained over this idea that Ethiopia could block the Nile someday, so they would send an aboon from the Coptic Church to Ethiopia to release the waters of the Nile when there was a drought. So this is what the reality is, though. So the energy generation potential is enormous in Ethiopia, possibly an extremely large boost in energy generation. This is historical, and then they just recently put online the Gibe 3 on the Omo River. But this is one reservoir could be very significant. So the timeline of what's going on there. In 1964, the Bureau of Reclamation, here they did a study, and they identified 4 different locations, one called the Border Site, which became the Renaissance Dam Site. The Nile Basin Initiative in 1999 formed as a coalition of all the different countries under the guidance of the World Bank. So in 2011, Prime Minister Meles Zenawi announced the project would be constructed. Unilaterally, the impact assessments and design were not released to the other countries initially. 2012, an international panel of experts was convened, 2 members from each country and 4 international experts to review the documents. They were initially secret. They were leaked to the public. And they identified all of the things that needed to be studied still, including environmental and social impact assessments. There's ongoing trilateral negotiations since then. In March 2015, a declaration of principles were signed, a great step forward. In a lot of ways, it was sort of an agree to agree. It didn't lay out some of the technical details on what needed to be done or what would be done. And they've hired a French and Dutch consultant company initially to provide recommendations on what to do. Well, since then, the Dutch consultant has withdrawn. They said that they can't guarantee a quality study. They've hired another French company. So the two are trying to come up with recommendations, full environmental social impact assessment for the Nile in a very short period of time. Potential benefits or effects, In Sudan, increased control of flows from Ethiopia could greatly increase the irrigation potential, decrease the sediment flowing through, improve the flood risk management, improve hydropower generation. Some of the risks: loss of flood recession agriculture. The Nile will no longer flood in Sudan. I can pretty much guarantee you that. The flood, it'll be from the tributaries or from the smaller areas, but the flood waters will significantly decrease. So those that rely on the floodwaters, they will have to adapt. Decreasing sediment load, loss of nutrients, and alteration of the ecosystems. Okay, the potential benefits of Egypt: it could create increased water security, reduce siltation, but the potential risk: decrease of water security. They don't know how Ethiopia is going to manage that dam or operate that dam, and then Egypt also may suffer decrease of hydropower generation. Okay, so the critical issues: there's no agreement of coordination between the countries. There's no known power purchase agreements to be able to share that. Ethiopia will be selling that power. Unknown impact of the flood recession agriculture in Sudan. There's no common analytical platform so far, like we have here. And the filling begins a little bit this year, next year. It'll fill significantly. This can hold about 1.5 times the flow at that location on the Blue Nile. So there is cause for expediency in this. So 2012, what I've been involved in initially with the consultancy with the Nile Basin Initiative to develop a model, worked with Hydros and John Kerr and Steve Setzer from here. So since then, I've been doing joint model development, doing trainings with this reservoir software in Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. 7 different sessions I've done, spent lots of time looking at the dams, figuring out how they operate, trying to gather the data, which they don't share data within, between them as well, and get an understanding. And then I give the model back to, and we work together on developing sort of strategic solutions. So 2016, we looked at how to do cooperative filling scenarios, and we'll talk about that very quickly. Okay, so water flows from Ethiopia across the border, across a cascade of reservoirs in Sudan. A lot of water gets pulled off for the Jazeera irrigation scheme and others, the largest irrigation area in Africa, in northern Africa at least. Then the remainder water goes into Egypt, into the High Aswan Dam, and generates electricity and goes to the city of Cairo. When Ethiopia fills that dam, what's the question is how much water will they release during that filling process? And of course, what the starting elevation is of the High Aswan Dam could greatly inform us what the impacts on the lower are. And then how will Egypt operate their reservoirs in response? And how will Sudan reoperate their reservoirs in response in between? So there's lots of dimensions to analyze. If they made an agreed annual release, I would call that pretty good. That's some basic level of cooperation that the Nile has never seen, and we hope that happens. But more can be done, really, with these modeling tools to explore. So we studied varieties of agreed annual releases, starting elevations, operations of the dams, and looked at, okay, what is a lot of different outputs, but what is the probability of Egypt, of the reservoir level hitting the critical power production level when Egypt can no longer generate electricity from the High Aswan Dam, and they can't guarantee the full deliveries downstream. Okay, so red numbers are bad, green numbers are good. The lower the initial elevation is creates a risk, and so the next thing we would do is look at implementing what I believe is the High Aswan Dam's drought management strategy. What is the realistic risk that they could hit that critical level, and what's an acceptable risk? And then finally, what we'll look at is as the elevation goes down, what if they worked closer together and they said, here's a minimum level. It's in Ethiopia's best interest to not have an upset Egypt. What if they guaranteed that 150 meters, which is 4 meters above the power pool elevation, does not get exceeded, and Ethiopia makes an additional release? So they work closer together, more interactively, to try to guarantee that Egypt's able to meet its downstream demands. So with this, if they're able to maintain that, a higher level of cooperation would be very beneficial. That takes a lot of data sharing. That takes a lot of working together. That takes using the same type of platforms to understand. That takes people communicating. Got some ways to get there. So they can reduce that risk. And then we look at what the trade-offs are, how much Ethiopia would have to sacrifice. So to end here, A high level of trust is still lacking. Formal data sharing is still lacking. There's a lot of interest among the individuals to cooperate and get beyond this hyperbole of Egypt. In Egypt, people are terrified on the streets. When I talk to people, if they know about it, they say, yes, everybody's worried about it. It's in the news every day. There's a lot of interest to find middle ground. Kathy Jacobs had a great quote. She said, it's not the risk, it's the perception of risk that the governments will act on. This is why some of these analyses need to be done to bring down what is the real risk here and what can we really do about it. Because so far there hasn't been a good analysis of this on the government level. I think an over-reliance on these outside experts. I like the model of having internal experts. So that's where I'm much more focused on. And these flexible analytical tools. And really the time is running out for the real negotiations. So a recent publication. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, I think there's no shortage of issues to talk about there. The difficulties of change, I think we've made that point. Okay, so I think we'll just have people talk direct. Yeah, okay, as we did before.
My excuse is I'm helping you to get the ball rolling. Listening to across the panel, starting with Michelle saying there's been a problem, not enough international networking. As a little bit of veteran of that international networking, there has been a huge amount over the past 3 decades. The trouble is it's had a sanctioned discourse. So just as climate change has not been talkable in USA in many constituencies, dams and hydropower were kind of off the agenda, certainly for developing countries, which is why Ethiopia spent 10 years and then finally told its public servants they're going to have to pay a month of their salary every year to build the dam, because the various institutions simply refused to fund them. And I'd like just to ask Reed about the questions of hydropower and its use in the USA. Because in China last year, talking at the Hydropower Association, it was interesting to hear the people from Three Gorges, biggest hydropower project in the world, although it was really built for flood control and navigation and water supply. The 30,000 megawatts is a bit of a byproduct. They were saying they discovered how useful the hydropower was to integrate renewables into their power system. It gave them black start control, it gave them frequency control, it gave them very rapid response when the wind went down or the sun went down. And it was quite interesting thinking, why have we not heard the same story in places like the USA and in Europe, where everyone is having difficulty integrating renewables, but somehow hydropower doesn't look across the energy-water border. And I'd like just to hear from you whether you think that the water sector talks too much to itself rather than talking across sectoral boundaries and kind of misses that opportunity to, and in the Anthropocene, very important issue, to start talking about how hydropower is going to make solar and wind actually possible at a higher insertion level. So just some thoughts on that.
I do think the water sector tends to talk a lot to itself, and the previous panel discussed the fact that the complexity of these issues tends to mean that public input gets discounted or not provided at all, that those public opportunities aren't provided. And I'm not enough of a grid manager type to understand the full range of the benefits of hydropower. You as the engineer get this better than I do. I'll say that. And so but I do understand that there is this value of hydropower in more ways than one, as an energy source, and hydropower generation as creating flexibility that is valuable for purposes of other types of generation. But here's my thing, getting to my point about dam operations.
in the United States particularly. That private hydropower is the one kind that we are willing to fundamentally revisit every 30 to 50 years, and that we require being fundamentally revisited every 30 to 50 years. And so there is a process for that more than there is a process for public hydropower, that generated at Corps and Bureau facilities, or for the flood control or water supply operations of those facilities. And so my view is it's all valuable, and we need to recognize and try to, preserve those benefits to the extent we can, because as I said, we're not prepared to give them up. But what can we do by way of revised operations that will reduce the impacts while trying to preserve those benefits as much as we can?
Can I just kind of make a little comment on that? In Spain, this has been a critical point of public discussion for the last 6 years. When environmental flows have been discussed, how to be implemented, and the hydropower is, as I mentioned, a very powerful sector, this has been the main argument, and it's a true argument. In fact, hydropower right now, and Theo can correct me, but the numbers, the broad numbers, let's say it provides around up to 20% of energy in Spain. There has been a huge growth over the last 10 years in wind and solar, and hydropower provides the critical, absolutely critical role to be able to use renewable energies, because you don't have wind and energy all the time, and hydropower, you can just turn it on like that. And you can't do that with a coal plant, and you can't do that with a nuclear plant. So for those changes and for the stability of the energy grid system, hydropower is key. The debate is, and I think that's the problem, and this is publicly an issue among the water world, not only water, stakeholders, everybody. This is a very public part of the debate. I think the issue is what you work on, which is the key part. They will not consider, this is their argument, which is true, but that means, in their view, the operations, dam operations cannot be touched. And there's many ecologists that have started working with them and engineers and saying, we're not saying turn off the hydropower dams. You're saying alter your operating systems enough so that you don't have 0 environmental flows. Maybe you can have 5. Maybe we can find alternative ways. And there's one experience, particularly in a river in northern Spain, where the Catalan Water Authority negotiated with small hydro. It's a small river, well, not so small, but kind of, in American terms, small, that had dozens of small hydro operators. And they negotiated with all of them an environmental flow regime in which they found flexible ways of giving them, for instance, longer licensing periods or more power generating capacity here than there, so that each of them could alter their operating still without losing the capacity. In the big hydro, it's a network system in Spain. It's all connected, and there is one public agency that connects and tells who to turn off and on all kind of electricity production. There are 2 major electric companies, private, and they have a lot of power. And so the argument is that they're utilizing this argument, which is a true argument, to not incorporate any flexibility whatsoever. And I think there's just a lot of room. If models were transparent, if there was more constructive dialogue, they could alter their operation capacity, guaranteeing electricity production, but at the same time getting some of the environmental benefits.
Can I just add something?
I think.
Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So it's an interesting question in terms of whether water talks too much to itself and whether it should be engaging more with energy. And I think in the Canadian context, we actually, unfortunately, at least in British Columbia, have one case where it's almost the reverse of I think energy doesn't want us to engage. And so it's in British Columbia, it's about 94% reliant on hydroelectricity. For a while, the environmental movement felt like that was a bad thing because of the impacts of large dams. Then it kind of shifted to being like, okay, maybe that's better than the coal and oil sand development and all that sort of thing. And then right now we're in the middle of, it has been approved to move ahead with one kind of probably the last possible site to build a large dam in the province. But it was sort of justified around increasing demand, but there's also some clear indication that the demand was the oil sands and hydraulic fracturing production. So energy production is requiring the creation of hydropower production. So there's this bizarre kind of tense relationship between those two. And so I think we definitely need to start thinking about that nexus much more. And I think we not only need to think about it as a tool, recognizing water storage and hydro production can be one way to perhaps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as manage water. I don't think we're thinking carefully enough about how we construct them and operate them in such a way that they don't also contribute to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, Jason, and then I think there, and then. Yeah.
I had a question for Kevin, the modeler, and it's a question that, for me, occurred in conjunction with the Bureau's 2012 basin study for the Colorado River Basin initially, but relates to the slides on the law of the river and the management instruments that you had in your comparative table. As Brad Udall mentioned earlier in his talk, there are often disagreements over exactly how the management instruments work, what they mean. Brad mentioned Article 3D, and I mentioned in my question Article 3C. My question is, I guess, how do and should modelers account for disagreements over what the existing rules mean and how they're going to play out when engaging in future scenario planning?
Okay, so reclamation will, they need to try to keep everybody either happy or equally unhappy. Everybody hates the model, but nobody comes up with something better necessarily. So there'll be assumptions on interpretations of the compact. There'll be assumptions on what the upper basin demand curves are going to be, things that everybody knows are not probably realistic, but we're going to put them anyway because we have to assume something. And if you want to keep Wyoming and Colorado at the table, then you gotta keep them kind of happy by putting in their assumptions. But of course, other people will go change those assumptions. Let Arizona go change that upper basin demand curve and see what they think the reality is. Depending on who you are and who your client is, who the stakeholders are, you can play with these things all you want and explore the different grounds. But if you're sitting in that central role that reclamation plays in, they're doing their best to keep a tool functioning that everybody's or that it will keep everybody at the table. So that's a huge, challenging question.
John?
Kevin, I have a question about the issue of trust you raised at the end with respect to the Nile, and you worked on the Minute 319 modeling work, which started with the diffusion of the sort of modeling technology from the United States to Mexico at the technical level. Could you talk a little bit about the process in which the sort of level of trust in the model migrated on the Mexican side up to the political and policy actors who were then negotiating so that the trust at the technical level worked at the political and policy level?
It's a little bit outside of my knowledge because we did the best we could to help them with that, but I mean, how it disseminated upwards, I mean, it was interesting, sort of, I think the modeling in that played a critical role of them understanding how tightly run the system is, and I think that really was communicated through multiple ways, the modeling being one of them. Yeah, I mean, sort of what went on after it left my world, I'm a little unsure about, but there's probably people here that know much more than I do about that one.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Benson regarding dam operations and in the context of the Colorado River and what we've been learning the past several days. I'd be interested to know if you think that the kind of the management around, for example, Lake Mead, and it represents kind of dam reoperations in your kind of terminology and your approach, considering all of the agreements that have been taking place over the last decades on shortage sharing. Does that kind of qualify as reoperations?
I think that the 2007 agreement that sort of links Mead and Powell in a way that hadn't been done before certainly qualifies. I think the piece on the Colorado that I have been somewhat more focused on, because
my focus on dam reoperations tends to focus heavily on environmental impacts, and with full credit and admiration for what was done on 319, most of what happens on the lower Colorado is not environmental in any way, shape, or form. Whereas the process relating to the Grand Canyon and Glen Canyon operations has a variety of different environmental outcomes that they're trying to focus on. And so that is a big undertaking that involves modeling and many, many other things, and engagement of states and tribes and environmental groups and Park Service and many others. And so I do think it qualifies. It has been, and I think for me, the LTEMP process that's going on with Glen Canyon is probably like the Cadillac version of what I'm talking about with respect to considering alternative operating regimes that consider this full range of values. I also realize that in some ways LTEMP might be, the Bureau would say that might be unrepresentative because you've got no direct user taking directly from or just below Lake Powell. So I guess on the Colorado, that's the one I would, and there's been some interesting stuff going on in the upper basin too. So the Colorado is one of the places where maybe this activity is more robust than it is in some other parts of the West for reclamation.
I'd be interested, this is sort of an unanswerable question, but interested in thoughts from the panel, and as well Doug Kenny, who has a good book on energy water nexus. My three tidbits of anecdotal information are the last cucumber I bought came from Spain. I come from the Pacific Northwest, and I have some familiarity with negotiations between Alcoa and Bonneville Power Administration, in which Intalco, the plant in Whatcom County, Washington, was very proud of its ability to taper their pot line down in response to huge demands on Bonneville Power during a drought, plus large air conditioning use in California, which then plays up into Arrow Lakes and makes Nakusp, BC, a lousy place to take a vacation because Arrow Lakes takes the water level hit. I also happen to have a daughter who is a senior modeling engineer on batteries for Tesla, which I think is a whole nother layer outside of water on how things might work in the future. Of course, they have their huge plant in the middle of the Nevada desert, which has some other impacts. But what my interest is the thoughts on the panel of how we look at how all of this really isn't playing out even between one nation with a border with another nation, but is really a global situation.
I couldn't agree more. I think, the example of the cucumber is actually excellent. In the whole area in Spain where the whole pressures are, where all the impacts are, they're a big thing when they go out and give talks because they're very active internationally to get that international network of support. They always talk about their lettuces. I'm going to have to tell them to talk about cucumbers instead of lettuces. But a lot of the decisions that are made, and in Europe this is a discussion. This is now a very clear discussion with TTIP and everything else. A lot of the decisions that are being made on electricity generation, on water management issues, have economic implications that way transcend anything that we could possibly discuss on the local or national level, unquestionably.
I guess just to add to that, I would agree as well in that. And it's interesting, I think these case studies that we've been hearing about over the last few days show how, in some ways, there's a global problem in that there's this universal type of problem that keeps emerging quite locally. So it's sort of repetitive that way, but also it's being affected by these global economic forces. And I think a lot of the time, certainly in the watersheds where I've been working, there's almost this frustration of trying to actually protect what is a place-based value in the face of placeless economies. And so it's a huge challenge, and I don't think any one particular watershed has figured out how to do that because you're just grappling at such a different scale that you don't actually even have jurisdiction over. So I absolutely agree. It's a global problem that we need to think about in that particular scale and frame.
I'll just add one thing, like the ability to analyze those complexities are something that stretches my mind. I never get how people do these equilibrium models, global equilibrium models, to try to measure what trade drops in one, and they're phenomenally complex. But they're to be able to get that sort of geographic spread, they also become very very generalized, and like lumping an entire country into one box, or one entire river basin in one box. So that gets to an aggregation level that I'm not interested in as a modeler. I know people don't, sometimes my modeling is too aggregated for some people. That is such huge scale, but it's true, and we try to balance. We're part of this new FE2W network, the Food, Environment, Energy, Water Network, trying to think of ways to connect all of these pieces together. But from an analytical point of view, it's really hard to keep to have it pass the laugh test.
And last question.
Well, thanks to all the panelists. I wanted to follow up with Nuria on your presentation, which I enjoyed very much. And you mentioned and identified the kind of law of unintended consequences with the market, and your lessons or recommendations around the need for explicit goals and the need for clear boundaries are well taken. I guess one of the questions I have for you is, there's a range of goals that can't be prescribed? I mean, are there limits to markets, and what are the limits to markets? And I would ask you in the context of a range of initiatives here in the U.S., whether it's the Water Funders Initiative talking about quote-unquote healthy water markets, or the Drought Resilience Action Plan putting on market-oriented instruments, or a Natural Resource Investment Center that's trying to emphasize markets. What would you tell them are the goals that can be achieved versus the goals that can't be achieved through market reforms based on the Spanish experience?
Very cautiously generalizing, which I'm very cautious about, because I think it is very, very, very context specific. And so I think the fact that has been dysfunctional in Spain doesn't mean that they can be dysfunctional everywhere else. I mean, and so I'm not ideological about this. I'm just telling one experience. I do think that the more local the scale, the more easy it is to control outcomes, goals, procedures, and operations. The more global the scale, as the volume and the space increases, I think what tends to happen is that you export the scarcity, socio-political challenges, political conflicts that you're trying to resolve by the conflict, and you either are transporting them to another geographical area or into the future. So I do think that in general, we have to be very cautious if you're trying to. I think there's this tendency to think that because electricity can be put in a grid system, and the more interconnected, the more effective and efficient we are, and the better socioeconomic outcomes we have, we can do the same with water. And we forget that water has so many other values beyond exclusively H2O, as we all know. So I don't need to repeat it here. But I think the tendency is there. And I don't think we want to replicate what has happened in areas where we have, instead of a natural system, we have a grid. That's not what we want. We don't want another California. We don't want the challenges of the lower Colorado. We don't want to repeat that. And so I think issue of scale is crucial, because the more local the scale, I think they can be really effective to solve local problems. Local, I mean, however you want to define local. But I think the issue of scale, both geographically, economically, volumetrically, in terms of hydrologically, is key.
I think, unless there's something urgent that anyone wants to add to that, I think that's an excellent note to end on. If you could just join me in thanking our speakers for an excellent panel.